Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip behind the sealed walls of one of the most secretive lives in modern history. Imagine a fortress with no phone lines, blacked out windows, and a goat or two wandering the perimeter. Inside? The world's most wanted man, sipping tea in slippers. Not a scene you expected, is it? They probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Nestled in the northern hills of Pakistan lies the sleepy city of Abbottabad. It's a place of tidy neighbourhoods, military academies, and dusty hillsides that blush pink under the sunset. If the name rings familiar, it's because the quiet was shattered one night in 2011, but we'll get there. For now, the city is still unaware of its notorious guest. On the outskirts of Bilal town, a relatively upscale area known for its safety and quiet streets, there stands a compound that doesn't quite fit in. Its walls rise higher than the surrounding houses, 18 feet tall in some places, topped with barbed wire. No windows face the street. No phone lines lead in or out. From above, it looks more like a prison than a home. To the neighbours, it's called the Waziristani house, because of the reclusive, secretive people inside. In reality, it is the final hiding place of Osama bin Laden. When he first arrives here in 2005, after years on the run, it is the perfect ghost's lair. Abbottabad is not the lawless tribal zone many would expect him to pick. It's the opposite. Orderly, safe, and perhaps most importantly overlooked. Some Pakistani locals joke that hiding in a place so close to the military is the best way to avoid suspicion. And it seems to work, at least for a time. Bin Laden does not arrive alone. He brings with him his most loyal courier, Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed, also known by his nom de guerre, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, and Ahmed's brother. These two men build the compound from scratch, supposedly under the guise of being businessmen returning from abroad. They purchased the land using fake identities, paying in cash. It cost nearly $250,000, an amount that raises no local eyebrows. Wealthy expatriates returning to Pakistan is not uncommon. The construction unfolds with careful calculation. The house is 3 stories tall, with walls deliberately higher than needed. The third-floor balcony is surrounded by privacy barriers. Even the trash is managed carefully. No one burns garbage outside, unlike nearly every other household in the neighbourhood. The house has no internet and no landlines, cutting off the easiest routes for surveillance. There's even a small vegetable garden and a few cows and chickens to help make the house more self-sufficient. It's as much bunker as it is residence. By the time Osama bin Laden moves into the upper floors, he is thinner, greyer, and more deliberate. He rarely leaves his room, never steps outside, and sees the world only through a tiny slit of the window, if at all. Yet from this tight little prison, he continues to influence and correspond, playing chess with jihadist movements across continents. He is 48 when he arrives, and the toll of years on the run shows. His beard, which once flared dramatically, is often dyed black to conceal the aging. His gait is slow. Some reports suggest he's dealing with health issues, possibly kidney problems, maybe even chronic pain. But no dialysis machines or heavy medication ever show up, raising questions that historians still debate. Was his illness exaggerated, or did he manage it through traditional remedies and luck? Inside the compound, time behaves strangely. Days bleed into each other, marked only by the morning calls to prayer and the soft hum of domestic life. Children run and play in the courtyard, wives cook meals in the cramped kitchen. And all the while, bin Laden exists in a kind of spectral presence, just above them, always present but rarely seen. He reads, he writes, he listens. The compound's size creates its own illusion. From the outside it might look vast, but inside space is partitioned carefully. The upper floor, reserved for bin Laden and his immediate family, is stark. A mattress on the floor, a small desk, a few books, a tiny TV connected only to a DVD player, used sparingly. His world has shrunk to this, rooms layered with silence, interrupted only by the rustle of paper or whispered prayers. What's strange, even for a man in hiding, is how structured the operation remains. Communication with the outside world happens through memory cards and handwritten letters. A courier shuttles these missives, sometimes on foot, sometimes by car, across borders, delivering the leader's thoughts and instructions to the larger Al-Qaeda network. But this creates a bottleneck, and over the years, the man who once commanded global headlines finds himself increasingly out of sync with the movement he helped build. His orders grow less relevant, his writings more philosophical than tactical. He's turning into an echo. Still, he's not entirely cut off. He watches recordings of news broadcasts. He follows reports on drone strikes, prison breaks, and the rise of new figures within militant circles. And most surprisingly, he obsesses over Western politics. In his private stash of reading material, reports about the European Union, American think tanks, even self-help guides. Yes, the mastermind of 9/11 once owned books on overcoming stress and building better teams. The irony is not lost on anyone. But in Abbottabad, time isn't kind. As the months crawl by, Bin Laden watches his children grow older, his family adapt and his own role fade. He becomes a father figure in the most literal sense, reading to kids, offering life lessons, trying to maintain some kind of normalcy. His wives take over the logistics of daily life. One of them, Amal, is especially close to him and sleeps in the same room. Others live in different quarters, barely speaking to one another. Tensions simmer beneath the surface. The children, born inside these walls, know nothing of the outside world. They've never attended school, never touched a swing set in a park. They whisper games in the shadows and learn their lessons from handwritten pages. Occasionally, they peek through slats in the curtains to glimpse the sky or the neighbour's dog. That dog, by the way, is something of a neighbourhood mystery. It's loud, constantly barking. A small joke floats around that even the animals sense something odd behind those walls. And yes, even the neighbours gossip. They notice that no one ever visits, that the kids don't attend school, that the residents burn no trash, never host guests, and always seem to move quietly, deliberately. But they never act on these instincts. Perhaps it's cultural deference, perhaps fear, or maybe the compound's shadow is just thick enough to keep curiosity at bay. But that, of course, won't last. One particularly strange fact. The house has no internet, no satellite dishes, no signs of entertainment, yet somehow Bin Laden remains alarmingly informed. Some speculate that DVDs or even USBs smuggled in by couriers brought him content, maybe even YouTube videos and speeches. There's a theory, albeit fringe, that he kept up with conspiracy theories and right-wing commentary, absorbing the West's own cultural paranoia like a sponge. He may have even believed that the US economy was about to collapse. If true, it's almost poetic. And while the outside world spins faster, Arab Spring, drone strikes, civil wars, inside the compound, the rhythm never changes. Morning prayers, simple meals, soft whispers. Bin Laden, once the face of terror, now lives like a monk under siege. He has money, stacks of euros and rupees hidden in closets, but no place to spend it. He has power, theoretically, but no direct control. What remains is ideology, letters, family, and maybe that's the most surreal part. The world's most feared man quietly aging in a crumbling room. His kingdom now reduced to dusty bookshelves and outdated videos, while children play hopscotch beneath his feet. Bin Laden's ability to vanish after the fall of Tora Bora remains one of the great disappearing acts of modern times. In late 2001, American and Afghan forces closed in on the mountain caves along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The US military dropped thousands of pounds of explosives, pounded ridge lines with artillery, and funneled troops through narrow valleys, convinced that Osama bin Laden was hiding somewhere among the icy cliffs. For a brief window, he probably was. And then, nothing. Like sand between fingers, he was gone. Historians still argue whether bin Laden escaped with advance warning, or whether US command underestimated the terrain. Some speculate he used donkeys. Others suggest bribed guides. A few even entertain the possibility of help from sympathetic elements within Pakistan's intelligence apparatus. What's clear is this: bin Laden vanished, and the world began to search for a man who no longer left a digital trace. The early years after his disappearance were a swirl of rumours, false sightings, and increasingly bizarre theories. Some claimed he was dead, killed in the mountains, his body hidden. Others suggested he'd undergone plastic surgery. A fringe few believed he had been captured secretly and was being held by intelligence agencies. The truth, as usual, was far less dramatic but far more unsettling. Bin Laden was simply slipping through the cracks. He moved through the tribal belt of Pakistan, shadowed by his loyal couriers and protected by layers of trust and fear. At times, he lived in his safe houses so modest they could be mistaken for goat sheds. In one town, he reportedly passed as a deaf mute to avoid speaking and giving away his Arabic accent. In another, he may have lived literally next door to a police station, hiding in plain sight with help from locals whose silence was either bought or born of shared ideology. Despite the cave jokes and the image of him as a man hiding underground, Bin Laden's years on the run were more often spent in bedrooms, safe houses, and quiet corners of dusty towns. His movement was rare, planned weeks in advance, and usually under the cover of night. He had no phone, no email. He communicated exclusively through trusted couriers, who risked capture every time they left his side. But this level of invisibility came at a cost. The Bin Laden of 2002 to 2005 was not the man who once made sweeping declarations on video. He was shrinking from public view, his influence relying on the mystique of survival. In jihadi circles, that mystique had power. The longer he evaded capture, the more he became a symbol, not just of defiance, but of near mythical endurance. By 2003, American intelligence had rerouted much of its attention to Iraq, hunting weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein. This gave Bin Laden more breathing room, though it didn't reduce the risk. Predator drones now circled the skies over Pakistan's tribal regions. Any suspicious activity, a gathering, a large meal, a strange car could be flagged. But Bin Laden, ever paranoid, kept his gatherings tiny. No cell phones, no digital anything. His very survival was a blueprint for old-school anonymity. At one point during these years, he reportedly lived in Haripur, a Pakistani city just 35 kilometres from Islamabad. There, his compound was simpler, more temporary. Again, he was joined by family and couriers. Again, he lived upstairs, away from windows. And again, no one asked too many questions. It was during these itinerant years that Bin Laden's family dynamic grew more complicated. His multiple wives did not always travel together. Some stayed behind in Iran, where they had been detained after fleeing Afghanistan. Others rejoined him slowly. By the time he reached Abbottabad, the household had solidified, but tensions from years apart lingered. Rivalries simmered, especially among the older wives whose influence competed for limited space in a confined world. What's often missed in this chapter of his life is how utterly domestic it became. The most hunted man in the world was waking up to the smell of cardamom tea, hearing roosters crow, and trying to soothe crying children while debating geopolitical strategy with courier messengers. Imagine Che Guevara doing laundry, or Napoleon making grocery lists. It's an almost absurd contrast, but that was Bin Laden's reality. Even in these smaller safe houses, he tried to keep writing letters, philosophical treatises, strategic suggestions for Al-Qaeda's regional affiliates. Some were grand in scope, urging new fronts in Somalia or Yemen. Others were oddly specific, like advising that future plots avoid killing Muslims. He even toyed with rebranding Al-Qaeda, believing the name had become too toxic. One of his suggested alternatives, Taifat al-Tawheed, or the monotheism group. He was thinking like a CEO stuck in a basement office, and then, in 2005, the opportunity to build something more permanent arose. His courier, Ibrahim al-Kuwaiti, found the land in Abbottabad. It was a risk, far from the tribal areas where hiding was easier, but also a strange kind of shield. Abbottabad wasn't just any city. It was home to Pakistan's military elite, including its most prestigious military academy. To hide in a place crawling with generals and cadets was audacious, but perhaps in Bin Laden's eyes, brilliant. So the land was purchased. The walls went up. The compound began to take shape. The move to Abbottabad marked a new phase. He would no longer flit from town to town, safe house to safe house. Here he would dig in. Here he would live, perhaps even die. But not everyone in the inner circle agreed with this decision. Some feared the compound, with its height and security features, would draw attention. Others warned that being too close to Pakistani military infrastructure could backfire if loyalties shifted. Bin Laden waved off the concerns. He believed Allah would protect him. That, and his meticulous security protocols, which involved courier-only communication, never stepping outside and making sure his face was never seen, even from above. For years, this strategy worked. American intelligence knew he was somewhere in Pakistan but didn't know where. Drone strikes killed multiple bin Ladens, each later revealed to be a lookalike or mistaken identity. Dozens of audio and video messages attributed to him were analysed for clues, but little hard data emerged. He became a ghost wrapped in static. It's around this time that certain signs suggest bin Laden became more reflective. His writing deepened, drifting toward theology and philosophy rather than military strategy. He expressed frustration with al-Qaeda's affiliates, especially when they carried out attacks that killed Muslims or civilians. He lamented the branding problems of the jihadist movement, and more quietly, he began to grapple with legacy. Would his children inherit his ideology? Would his sons become fighters? Would his daughters remain hidden behind compound walls forever? These were questions he couldn't answer, because he couldn't leave. His own confinement had begun to wear on him. In letters later recovered, he wrote about the stresses of hiding, the physical strain of aging without medical care, and his fears about being betrayed, not by enemies, but by chance. A courier taking a wrong turn, a child peeking over the wall, a neighbour noticing something odd. And then there were the dreams. One wife recalled that bin Laden spoke often of dreams in these years, dreams in which he escaped, dreams in which he was captured, dreams filled with symbolism, floods, birds, strange faces. In Islamic tradition, dreams hold great weight, often seen as divine messages or warnings. For a man so shaped by faith, these nighttime visions likely carried real emotional impact. They made him cautious, paranoid, almost eerily still. Yet for all that caution, bin Laden never seemed to imagine that his compound might one day be surrounded by American helicopters. In his mind, he would either die by martyrdom in the field or remain hidden forever. The possibility of being found in pyjamas watching a bootleg documentary probably never crossed his mind. Still, as the months turned into years, he prepared. He rehearsed what to do in case of a raid. The family had escape plans, including routes through the compound, stashes of cash, and clothes packed for flight. He asked children to memorize their lines. Pretend you're deaf. Pretend you're dumb. Say nothing. Trust no one. He also planned for death. He kept documents detailing which of his sons should take up the cause. He outlined who could be trusted, who should marry whom, and even who should take care of his remaining family. It was equal parts succession planning and eerie bedtime routine. Yet even in all this, he never stopped believing he had more time, that the compound was secure, that the curtains drawn just right would keep him safe. In retrospect, it was a dangerous delusion, but for a time, it worked. For years, the ghost remained at rest behind his walls, a prisoner by choice, a father by habit, a leader in exile, scribbling orders on sheets of paper while chickens clucked in the yard. He had survived bombs, betrayals, and the full weight of the world's largest military machine. Now, tucked away in a bottabad, he seemed almost to believe he'd outlasted it all. But shadows were growing, tracks were forming, and somewhere, a courier had already made the mistake that would bring helicopters roaring through the night. The compound, once a blank plot of dusty earth, slowly took on the shape of a fortress designed not just for privacy, but for permanence. Construction began quietly in 2004, and within a year, it was hard to miss. Local labourers did the work, but none were allowed past certain sections. The third floor? Off limits. The builders never questioned it, or if they did, they wisely kept their thoughts to themselves. One thing they all noticed, though. This was not a normal house. Once complete, the house loomed large over its surroundings. At over 3,500 square feet, the compound included multiple buildings, a high boundary wall topped with barbed wire, and a double security gate. It even had a hidden room behind a bookshelf and a fake wall or two, like something out of a spy movie minus the glossy cinematics. There was no internet access, no satellite TV, no landline. Even inside, the rooms were sparse, echoing with a kind of monastic austerity. The main building had 3 levels. On the ground floor were living quarters, a kitchen, and areas for the courier and his family. The second floor housed some of bin Laden's wives and children. The top floor, sealed and guarded in every way, was the lair of Osama bin Laden himself. Inside his quarters, things were modest. A mattress on the floor, a small desk cluttered with papers, and a television with an old-school DVD player. The contrast is almost absurd. the man who orchestrated one of the most devastating terror attacks in history, living in a room that wouldn't look out of place in a college dorm. Outside, the design was equally utilitarian. There was a small patch of land for gardening, with vegetables and medicinal herbs. A few cows and chickens were kept for milk, eggs and meat. This gave the family a measure of self-reliance, though the real reason may have been psychological. Routine, purpose, the illusion of normalcy. They even grew marijuana for homeopathic use. That part rarely makes the history books. But what truly baffled those who later examined the compound wasn't just its functionality, it was its visibility. Despite its security measures, the place stuck out. Neighbouring homes were modest, open, lived in. This one was tall, enclosed and silent. No cars ever came or went. No guests ever dropped by. Children played in the yard but were never seen outside it. Curtains stayed drawn, and strangest of all, the residents never burned their garbage. In a city like Abbottabad, where homes routinely get rid of trash by open-air burning, this was peculiar. Instead, the residents of the compound collected their garbage, kept it indoors, and disposed of it in controlled private burns, or stored it altogether. Why? Because even a single piece of mail, a food wrapper or a medicine bottle could blow the whole operation. And bin Laden knew it. He was obsessive about security. There were strict rules about movement inside the compound. No one used names aloud. Children were coached to maintain silence. They were forbidden from looking over the walls or speaking to outsiders. Even a peek through the curtains required a ritual of care. Inch the curtain back just slightly, no sudden movement, and only during certain times of day. In some parts of the house, holes were drilled into walls for peering discreetly outside. Mail, messages and cash were all carried by couriers. It was all analogue. No electronics that could be traced. No phone calls, no radio signals, just paper, memory and silence. Despite this, the compound didn't feel entirely like a bunker. To those inside, it was home. Children giggled and squabbled. Wives cooked elaborate meals, even arguing over recipes and rituals. Bin Laden would occasionally emerge from his quarters to sit with the family during mealtimes. He told stories, gave fatherly advice, even cracked dry jokes. Imagine sitting in a room, drinking goat milk tea while your father warns you about the dangers of Western materialism and then gently reminds you to share your toys. That was life at the compound. One mainstream historical fact that's often overlooked: Abbottabad wasn't a random choice. It's a military garrison town, home to the Pakistan Military Academy, essentially the Pakistani West Point. The compound was less than a mile away from that very base. US officials would later find this geography suspicious, if not incriminating. But at the time, it may have been precisely what made the location seem secure. Who would expect America's most wanted man to be hiding a stone's throw from Pakistan's elite forces? Whether Pakistani officials knowingly harboured bin Laden is still hotly debated. Some argue rogue elements within the Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) may have known. Others believe it was genuine incompetence. The compound was never raided. No police ever showed up. No intelligence officers seemed curious. It just stood there, oddly large, oddly quiet, and completely untouched. One fringe theory suggests the compound was originally built as a safe house for someone else, perhaps a retired intelligence asset, and later repurposed for bin Laden. This remains unconfirmed, but it adds another layer to the mystery. Inside the home, the decor was minimal. No paintings, no luxury. Just prayer rugs, plastic chairs, and rows of books. Hundreds of them. Topics range from religion to world politics, conspiracy theories, and health guides. Some were in Arabic, others in English. Titles like guerrilla warfare, the US budget crisis, and natural healing were discovered later. There were even books about numerology, dream interpretation, and economic collapse. Bin Laden himself was a creature of habit. He rose before dawn for prayers, exercised in his room, usually by walking in circles, and spent hours writing long-form letters and essays. Some of his work during this time reads more like diary entries than strategy memos. He reflected on the war, on the failures of the Muslim world, on his legacy. He seemed aware that his influence was waning and obsessed over how to preserve it. And yet, in many ways, he was still operating as a distant commander. Through his couriers, he tried to influence affiliates in Yemen, Somalia, and the Maghreb. He criticised their brutality, especially attacks that harmed Muslims or alienated potential allies. He wanted to reframe Al-Qaeda's image, not as global villains, but as defenders of Islam. How's that for a branding crisis? But he was losing control. The decentralized nature of Al-Qaeda meant regional commanders often acted independently. They didn't always wait for his approval. The organization was morphing into something he no longer fully recognized. It haunted him. And so he kept writing, hoping that his guidance, smuggled out on thumb drives and scribbled notes, would reassert some measure of influence. Meanwhile, life inside the compound trudged on. The wives rarely interacted. Their quarters were separated. Disagreements were handled through passive avoidance, not confrontation. Children were schooled in private by their mothers and sometimes by bin Laden himself. There were no formal textbooks, just handwritten lessons, oral instruction, and memorization of religious texts. One daughter later described how they were taught to never draw attention, to trust no stranger, and to be ready to run at a moment's notice. Yet they celebrated birthdays, shared jokes, played games with sticks and stones in the courtyard. They were, despite everything, a family, though a family suspended in time, living in a fishbowl of fear and secrecy. One quirk that continues to puzzle investigators: bin Laden had a curious fascination with himself. In the compound, they found multiple videos of him watching old footage, his own speeches, news segments, even documentaries about 9/11. He would sometimes watch silently, expressionless, perhaps searching for clues in his own eyes, perhaps reminding himself who he once was. And so, the Abbottabad compound settled into a surreal routine: silence and sermons, cows mooing in the distance, children's laughter muffled by concrete, a man who changed the world now reduced to pacing the floor of his bedroom like a ghost, trapped in a very specific kind of purgatory. The goats? Yes, they were real. The chickens too. The compound raised enough livestock to supplement their meals. There's a story, half fact, half neighbourhood legend, that one goat escaped once and wandered into a neighbour's yard. The resident brought it back, receiving only a quick nod through the gate before the door slammed shut. They never saw the man's face, just a shadow, just enough to fuel whispers. That's how things stayed. Years passed, the children grew, some of the wives aged visibly, but the compound remained static. It became part of the neighbourhood's backdrop. Strange, sure, but no one pushed too hard. And inside, bin Laden kept counting days, scribbling thoughts, and waiting for whatever fate had left for him. What no one knew, not yet, was that outside those towering walls fate was already moving. Tiny clues were starting to pile up. One man, one message, one trash fire. It was all beginning to unravel. But for now, inside that concrete sanctuary, the illusion held. Within the concrete maze of the compound, something much stranger than a fugitive was unfolding. An ongoing, uneasy drama of domestic life, powered by tension, traditions, and the gnawing hunger of confinement. This wasn't just a bunker, it was a home. A strange, silent, anxiety-soaked home, populated by Osama bin Laden, 3 wives, over a dozen children, and a few fiercely loyal couriers. In this tight, carefully sealed ecosystem, bin Laden's wives each carved out their space, roles, and unspoken rivalries. On paper, the arrangement had the air of Islamic tradition: polygamy, shared responsibility, patriarchal structure. But the compound wasn't a sprawling villa. There were no separate wings, no room for distance. Each wife lived on a different floor or room cluster, bumping into the edges of the other's territories. Like tectonic plates beneath a fragile house, they pressed against each other with a quiet, unrelenting pressure. The most senior of them, Khairia Seba, was a deeply educated woman. A PhD in child psychology from Saudi Arabia, she was bin Laden's 3rd wife and the most intellectually formidable. She had been separated from him for years during his time on the run, living under house arrest in Iran with some of their children. When she rejoined him in Abbottabad around 2010, the emotional fireworks were palpable. Khairia's return upset the balance. Amal al-Sada, the youngest and reportedly bin Laden's favourite, had occupied the de facto role of primary partner. Amal had married him in 2000 when she was just 17, and during their time in hiding she had remained closest to him, sharing his room, his meals, and his silence. She had borne several children within the compound and had grown comfortable in her position. The arrival of Kyria not only challenged this dynamic, but also reinvigorated old tensions between the wives. The compound may have been a prison, but the social chessboard inside was anything but stagnant. Passive-aggressive power moves, maternal pride, and subtle gestures of exclusion flavoured the women's interactions. Meals were sometimes prepared separately. Conversations were brief and necessary. Complaints rarely escalated, but only because there was no one to hear them. The third wife, Siham Sabah, was quieter. Also a scholar, she had studied Arabic literature and was mother to several of bin Laden's children. Of the three, she seemed the most willing to float in the middle, not allying too closely with either Kyria or Amal. Perhaps she had learned that neutrality was the only way to keep peace. Or perhaps she was just exhausted. Each woman had her own children to look after, and those children, born into the compound, became both companions and pawns in this carefully tense ecosystem. The compound's design reinforced this hierarchy. The wives had specific quarters, but there was no real privacy. Doors creaked open into narrow corridors, curtains hung instead of doors in some places, and sound travelled far in the concrete silence. Privacy was both a commodity and a weapon. Children instinctively picked up on the dynamics. They learned which rooms were open to them, which corners were off limits, which voices meant comfort and which meant trouble, and through it all stood bin Laden, the quiet patriarch, a figure of reverence, caution, and mystery. He was both involved and distant, playing roles both spiritual and practical. He taught, corrected, and occasionally played, but he never truly dropped his guard. Interestingly, even as he held this family together, he enforced surprisingly rigid codes. One of his more unexpected rules: no contact with the outside world, not even for emergencies. One time, a child fell and hit their head hard enough to cause serious injury. Rather than risk outside medical help, the family treated the wound in-house. Bandages, herbal balms, whispered prayers. It had to be enough. It was a gamble rooted in paranoia, and it might have been lethal if the wound had been worse. Bin Laden's grip extended beyond health. He dictated what the children studied, mostly religious texts and Arabic grammar, and ensured they followed strict schedules. Even play was structured. There were few toys, and those that existed had to be hidden instantly if someone knocked. The children were told that if anyone ever entered, they were to pretend they were deaf and mute. A child's game, perhaps, but with stakes higher than they could comprehend. And then there were the security drills. Periodically, bin Laden or the couriers would simulate an emergency, a bang on the door, a shouted order. Children had to scatter, hide, stay silent. They practiced these rehearsals the way other families practice fire drills. One wife later recalled how surreal it was to live every day as if someone were watching, because in theory, someone always could be. Still, even amid the watchfulness, human rhythms persisted. The children sang songs. They chased each other through the courtyard. They peered curiously at the sky, wondering about birds or helicopters. They heard distant honks of traffic, the occasional bark of the neighbour's dog, and dreamed about streets they'd never walked. These small lives unfolded like flowers pressed under glass. And in the middle of this fragile world, bin Laden tried to remain not just a symbol, but a father. He led prayers, gave small lectures, even handed out assignments. He wanted to cultivate loyalty, not just love. In one recovered note, he wrote instructions on how his sons should behave if captured, what to say, what to deny, and how to frame their father's mission. One of his sons, Khalid, was especially close to him. A young man now, Khalid had grown up on the run, accustomed to coded conversations and the rhythm of escape. He sometimes acted as an intermediary between the wives, helped with the children, and stood as a quiet enforcer of his father's rules. He also resented parts of his life, especially the endless confinement, and longed for a world he barely remembered. One report noted that Khalid often stood on the roof alone at night, staring at the stars. Whether he was dreaming of escape or watching for drones, no one ever knew. There were cracks forming even then. A young child might ask why they couldn't go to school like the kids they heard, laughing outside the walls. A wife might sigh too loudly while sweeping. A courier might arrive late. Every small moment carried weight, like dust settling on a scale. Over time, those grains became burdens. Yet, life marched on in stubborn routine. Meals were cooked in turn. Eggs in the morning, rice and lentils for lunch. Tea, always tea in the afternoon. Sometimes a special dish would be prepared for a religious holiday. Other times the meals were mechanical, eaten in silence, broken only by a single prayer or a whispered correction. One fringe tidbit often left out of traditional biographies: Bin Laden had a favourite cow. Yes, a cow. It grazed lazily in the compound's tiny field, provided milk daily, and was referred to affectionately as our secret weapon for calcium. While it's unclear if the affection was mutual, the cow was part of the compound's heartbeat, another strange comfort in an otherwise uncanny world. Despite his remote demeanour, Bin Laden sometimes indulged in small comforts. He had a stash of honey, which he believed had healing properties, both physical and spiritual. He sipped it slowly, almost ritually. He also liked pickled lemons, a taste from his youth in Saudi Arabia. Little pleasures, tucked between the pages of ideology. By now, the family had been in Abbottabad for years. It was no longer a safe house, it was home. Bin Laden's children knew nothing else. His wives had memorised every crack in the walls. The couriers had their routes rehearsed to muscle memory. And still, not a single phone call, not a single email, just paper, whispers, and unwavering discipline. This routine, so strange from the outside, was all they knew. Inside the walls, it worked. But time has a way of peeling back even the most careful planning. One courier grew bolder. A few neighbours started whispering. One child, just once, peeked too long through a crack in the wall. And Bin Laden, who had outlived wars, evaded entire armies and survived betrayal, began to feel the ghost of proximity tighten its grip. Still, he prayed. Still, he wrote. Still, he believed that if he could just hold the centre, everything would stay still. He didn't know it yet, but the cracks weren't just forming. They were widening. While the outer world assumed Bin Laden was either dead or buried somewhere in the tribal borderlands, something entirely different was happening behind the towering walls of Abbottabad. Within the compound, the quiet chaos of daily life revolved increasingly around the next generation. Children born not in caves or deserts, but in the strange safety of concrete silence. By the time the compound reached its final years, it held over a dozen children. Some were born on the run, others inside these very walls. All of them knew only secrecy, routine, and the distant echo of their father's fame. They were Bin Laden's children. By blood, by ideology, and by the heavy weight of expectation. Most of them had never been to school, never seen a park, never stepped foot in a grocery store or waved at a stranger from a moving car. Their world was the compound, its walls, its corridors, its strict rules. Even the idea of a neighbour was foreign. Anyone on the other side of that barbed concrete was a potential threat, or worse, a curious fool who might one day ask too many questions. Education came from inside. Their mothers served as teachers, and sometimes Bin Laden himself delivered lessons. The subjects were what you might expect: Quranic recitation, Arabic grammar, Islamic history. But they also covered strange ground: conspiracies about the West, apocalyptic warnings, and rigid instructions on obedience. The curriculum was both ancient and paranoid. For these children, knowledge was a blend of the sacred and the strategically defensive. Bin Laden saw this as his long-term legacy. He knew his days of battlefield leadership were over, but through these children, particularly the boys, he believed his ideological fire would carry on. He wrote long letters instructing them on how to lead, how to speak, how to suffer if necessary. He advised them to avoid joining the battlefield too early. "You're more valuable as thinkers now than martyrs," he once wrote in a note addressed to one of his sons. That said, he did not view them as mere vessels. He cared for them. He held them, read to them, played quiet games with them, though always beneath the umbrella of caution. One story, recounted by family members after the raid, describes how Bin Laden once entertained his youngest child by letting them draw on his hand with a dull pencil while he sat cross-legged composing a letter. It was a fleeting moment, soft and deeply human, nestled inside a world defined by hardness. The daughters, though equally protected, lived under even tighter constraints. They were taught modesty from the start, full coverings, no outside exposure, total silence if addressed by strangers. Their paths were clear: loyalty, piety, and marriage within the trusted circles of the ideological cause. But the psychological toll of this upbringing began to show. Children, resilient as they are, start to crack under constant pressure. especially when fear is the ambient air they breathe. Some became withdrawn, others overly aggressive. The games often mirrored the world they'd been trained to fear. Play-acting raids, hiding from invisible soldiers, mimicking the drills of sudden silence. They were told stories too, not fairy tales, but the family's version of legacy. Bin Laden's eldest sons were spoken of like heroes, especially the ones killed in battle. The name Hamza, for instance, became a kind of mystical echo in the compound. Bin Laden's golden child, groomed to be the future face of jihad. He wasn't living in the compound anymore, but his image hung heavy over those still within. Yet, not all the children idolised their father. Some grew restless. A few reportedly questioned the rules. One boy, about 10, once asked his mother if there was life outside the walls, beyond the fields, past the horizon. She scolded him, of course, but the seed had been planted. For children, the world is only as big as what they're allowed to see, and the cracks, even if tiny, eventually let light in. From the rooftop or tiny viewing slits, the children occasionally watched the neighbourhood come alive. Other kids walked to school in uniforms, men shouted in the market, women carried baskets. Life flowed just out of reach, painting a surreal contrast to their own existence. The world was happening, vibrant, spontaneous, messy, and they were frozen in time. One daughter, just 6, once saw a wedding procession from the slit in the top floor curtain. The music, the laughter, the burst of colour, it was, by her standards, pure fantasy. That night she asked her mother if such happiness was halal. Her mother didn't answer. Meanwhile, Bin Laden's control over the internal culture of the compound grew tighter. He approved every interaction between his children and outsiders, which meant, of course, there were none. When a courier's wife once brought a toy truck as a gift, Bin Laden allowed it, but only after it had been carefully inspected, and even then it was to be kept in a specific room. No running in the hallways, no shouting. Joy was permitted, but only in small doses. One detail that continues to intrigue historians is the children's emotional resilience. Despite the narrowness of their world, many adapted. They found routines, rituals. One boy liked to write secret letters, not to be sent anywhere, just rolled up and hidden in cracks between the walls. Another collected bottle caps from old containers, building towers in the yard until the caps were taken away for being too visible from above. They played in the garden too. Small as it was, it became their universe. A couple of fruit trees, a few rows of vegetables, patches of dirt. One child claimed the lemon tree as his territory and protected it from imaginary enemies during pretend battles. Another lined up ants in rows and declared them Bin and Ten's army. The name stuck for weeks until someone told their father, and it was quickly discouraged. Their meals were shared but quiet. Children ate with their mothers, sometimes with Bin Laden if he was in the mood. Food was basic but nourishing: flatbread, rice, lentils, milk, and sometimes mutton. Mealtime, more than anything, was a moment of strange semi-normalcy. Plates clinked, small whispers were exchanged, and then it would all fade again into the usual hush. For recreation, the compound had no electronics, no toys with batteries, no television channels, no internet. DVDs brought by the couriers were watched only by the adults, usually in the third-floor room behind heavy curtains. Sometimes, Bin Laden allowed the older children to watch religious lectures or historical documentaries. A few knew the faces of world leaders not from books, but from grainy footage shown in secret. Barack Obama, Tony Blair, George Bush, figures of menace or amusement, depending on the context. And through it all, Bin Laden wrote. Dozens of pages, sometimes in a single sitting. Instructions, ideas, responses to letters smuggled in from the wider network. He drafted speeches he might never give. He mused about the Arab Spring. He warned about corruption among jihadist leaders. He even considered writing a letter to the American people again, though it never got sent. He obsessed over legacy, not just operationally, but spiritually. Would these children carry the torch? Would they understand the why behind the hiding, the silence, the constant threat? Or were they, as he occasionally feared, growing too soft? In one recovered document, he frets that the children are losing their connection to struggle. They are used to walls, not deserts, he writes. They pray, but do they fear? That line stayed with analysts long after the compound was raided. The paradox of it, fearing that your children are not afraid enough, spoke volumes about the psychological labyrinth inside those concrete walls. Still, the children loved him. When they heard his steps down the hallway, they straightened. When he passed by, they looked down in respect. He kissed their foreheads before bed. He corrected them with kindness, rarely with anger. And once a week he told them a story, usually from Islamic history, often involving a prophet, a battle, or a divine test. And then the stories would end, the lights would dim, and the house would return to silence. Outside, the world crept closer. A drone flew too low one day. A courier mentioned something odd about a neighbour. A child found a wire poking through the dirt. Just a cable, maybe, or maybe not. But inside, bedtime came. Children yawned. Fathers sighed. And in the concrete cradle of Abbottabad, another day passed, and another one began. Exactly the same. For a man whose face was once more recognisable than that of any president or pop star, Osama bin Laden had mastered the impossible art of being unseen. But the longer he lived in the compound, the more his invisibility became a sort of myth, one that shielded him, but also dulled his edge. The outside world debated whether he was even alive. Inside Pakistan, the subject was like smoke, thick with rumour, impossible to grasp. The only thing certain was this: he wasn't where they were looking. Abbottabad was never supposed to be the kind of place that harboured global fugitives. Tidy, structured, almost sleepy, the city had more in common with a suburban college town than a terrorist stronghold. It was home to markets bustling with produce sellers, traffic that bumbled politely, and well-dressed students on their way to classes. It was also home to the Pakistan Military Academy, one of the country's most prestigious institutions, a symbol of national pride and professionalism. And yet, just 1.3 kilometres down the road from that very academy, Osama bin Laden lived comfortably for 6 years. He had no disguise, no prosthetic beards or facial surgery. He didn't change his name, he simply stayed put. It's the kind of trick so bold it almost defies logic. The obvious question still fuels debate among scholars and intelligence analysts alike. How? How could the most wanted man in the world live just miles from the heart of Pakistan's military brain, without being noticed? There are 3 main theories. The first, sheer incompetence. Pakistan's intelligence services were overwhelmed, fragmented, and more focused on other priorities. Bin Laden's name had faded from their day-to-day urgency. Without electronic communication or satellite ping, there was no trail to follow. The second theory, deliberate ignorance. Perhaps mid-level officials suspected something odd, but chose not to investigate. Too risky, too political, too entangled with old alliances. If you don't look under the rug, you can't be blamed for what's under it. The third, most controversial theory, complicity. That elements within Pakistan's military or ISI knew exactly where bin Laden was. Not the whole agency, perhaps, not an institutional decision, but rogue actors, ideologically sympathetic or bought off, who protected him for years. This theory remains unproven, but is whispered constantly in the hallways of intelligence circles. The compound itself was strange enough to raise flags. Locals called it the Waziristani Haveli, because of the family's secrecy and dialect. They noted the high walls, the lack of visitors, the children who never went to school, the trash that was never burned. One neighbour remembered offering his Wi-Fi password to the house once, thinking they simply couldn't afford internet. He received a stiff, polite refusal. Afterward, he never saw the man again. Still, no one reported anything. Pakistanis are famously private, and Bilal Town was a quiet neighbourhood. You didn't ask questions about someone else's house, especially not one surrounded by barbed wire. Then there were the small things, the tiny details that added up to something larger. A courier who shopped but never lingered. A car that never left the driveway. Lights on at odd hours. Children's toys visible but never children's laughter. Even the cows and chickens meant to blend in were somehow too pristine. More props than pets. One local shopkeeper remembered selling large amounts of bulk food to the same man each week. Flour, lentils, cooking oil. But he never saw anyone else from the household. Not once. This cloak of ordinary strangeness was part of the design. Bin Laden understood that standing out invites questions, but so does being too invisible. The house needed to be active, but quietly so. It needed to hum, not roar, and that's exactly what it did. But this balancing act had consequences. The The complete lack of communication meant bin Laden had almost no real-time insight into global events. News reached him through couriered USB drives, handwritten reports, and DVDs. His understanding of current events was weeks behind and often filtered through ideological lenses. He obsessed over the Arab Spring, for instance, but misunderstood many of its secular undertones. Still, he tried to shape the global conversation. He wrote speeches, outlined strategy, criticised younger jihadist leaders for their recklessness. He was especially concerned about al-Qaeda's affiliate in Iraq, an outfit that would eventually evolve into ISIS. Bin Laden saw them as too brutal, too divisive, and too eager to kill Muslims. In one letter, he warns them, "The people will turn on you." History, as it turned out, would validate that fear. In his solitude, bin Laden's thinking grew more philosophical. He wrote about global inequality, corporate greed, and environmental destruction. One recovered letter criticises American capitalism, laments global warming, and oddly, advocates for using solar energy in future jihadist compounds. It was equal parts revolutionary and environmentalist. But his ability to lead was waning. The couriers who carried his letters often had to wait weeks to receive replies. Plans lagged. Orders lost relevance. New leaders in the field were increasingly acting without his input. He was slowly becoming a relic. Revered, yes, but not indispensable. And still, no one came. He would sometimes look out through a slit in the curtain, watching the street beyond. He never stood near windows. He never opened doors himself. Even sunlight was rationed. A man of once grand charisma had reduced himself to a shadow, pacing 3 rooms like a trapped monk. Inside his quarters, he maintained meticulous notes, handwritten lists of supplies, family trees, drafts of letters. At one point, he catalogued everyone he'd ever known in the jihadist movement, where they were, what they'd done, who could be trusted. It was less a record of allies, and more an emotional ledger, the kind you build when you suspect your empire might be dissolving. And though he was largely isolated, he remained preoccupied with betrayal. He worried about spies, informants, even the loyalty of his own wives. He issued strict rules about behaviour. No visits, no unnecessary noise, no questions. When one wife wanted to leave the compound to visit a relative, he refused. The risk was too high. Even love, it seemed, was second to security. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the war raged on. Drone strikes in Waziristan, CIA raids in Afghanistan, Taliban offensives, Arab uprisings, American troop surges. The world turned, but inside the compound it was always quiet, always the same. Breakfast, prayer, reading, silence, rinse, repeat. And then, for the first time in years, a small mistake. A courier bought a SIM card. Nothing flashy, nothing illegal, just a small purchase at a local shop recorded as routine. But the Americans were watching. They'd been tracking this courier for months, tracing him from known al-Qaeda safe houses through winding roads to Abbottabad. It wasn't instant. It took time. Weeks of satellite imagery, patterns, heat signatures, a slow-building suspicion. What struck the analysts wasn't just the compound, it was the lifestyle. No phone, no internet, no trash burned privately. Children never seen at school. It wasn't the presence of something unusual. It was the absence of everything normal. And so the circle began to close. CIA drones flew higher. Satellite photos grew more detailed. Analysts began to call the compound the mansion. Still, they couldn't confirm who was inside. Not exactly. Just a tall man, occasionally seen pacing in a courtyard, always in a white robe, never in direct sunlight. They called him the Pacer. No voice, no face, just a height estimate and a movement pattern. That was enough. But inside the compound, the routine never broke. Bin Laden prayed. He wrote. He watched the news footage couriers delivered. He knew America was still looking, but he believed deeply that Allah would shield him, that he had found the one place they would never think to look. In one of his final letters, he warns his network not to rely on technology. The satellites see everything, he writes. Only Allah can make us invisible. It's a statement of faith, but also of fragility. Because the satellites were, in fact, watching. They had already found the ghost. The courier's name was Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed, known within jihadist circles as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. Trusted, discreet and loyal beyond reason, he was not just a messenger. He was the lifeline, the man who connected Osama bin Laden to the world outside the compound's concrete skin. His job was simple in concept, but immense in responsibility. Carry bin Laden's words across a web of war zones, safe houses and sympathizers, and return with news, questions and answers. It was Ibrahim, and sometimes his brother Abrar, who ferried bin Laden's handwritten letters to other al-Qaeda leaders, tucked inside clothing or stored on USB drives disguised as broken devices. They moved without fanfare, never lingering in cities too long, always changing vehicles, always doubling back on routes. It was a delicate choreography designed to dodge surveillance, checkpoints and betrayal. For years, it worked. The brothers were careful, trained in the art of silence. They never used phones. They avoided electronics altogether. Purchases were made in cash, movements planned by foot, public transport or borrowed cars. The compound's own vehicle, a white Suzuki van, was used sparingly and only in the most calculated ways, but eventually even the most seasoned routines can fray. One day, Ibrahim purchased a cheap SIM card in Peshawar, likely for reasons still unknown. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps it was meant for a non-sensitive task. But that number, once activated, pinged a location, and American intelligence was listening. This was the first whisper of a trail. The CIA had long been trying to trace bin Laden's whereabouts, and for years the search was cold. But they never stopped looking. When they intercepted a phone call referencing Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, they recognized the name. It had been flagged years earlier in detainee interrogations. Someone had said, "If you find al-Kuwaiti, you find bin Laden." The Americans latched on. Using signals intelligence, surveillance teams traced the SIM card's movements. It led them, not to some cave in Waziristan, but to a well-developed urban neighbourhood in Abbottabad. The house it pointed to was strange. High walls, no phone or internet connections, and a trash policy that practically screamed paranoia. What struck the analysts most were the behavioural patterns. The residents burned their garbage, never let outsiders in, and had children who never attended school. Then there was the tall man spotted pacing in the courtyard during limited hours, never appearing near windows or doors. They couldn't say it outright, but it felt like something was off. Still, no one jumped to conclusions. For all the US intelligence community knew, it could be a high-value courier's family or a retired fighter. But the pattern of courier movement was too perfect, too cyclical. The compound wasn't just a safe house, it was a hub. And if it was a hub, then someone important lived there. Back in Langley, the CIA began assembling what they called the Red Cell, a small team whose entire job was to analyse everything about the compound. They studied satellite images, heat signatures, water consumption, and even the building's blueprints. They noted how the third floor was shrouded, how one resident never stepped outside, how curiously the house had no internet but did have a satellite dish pointed not at any known provider, but possibly to a homemade relay. There were other indicators too. The women of the house were never seen outside. Laundry hung on the line suggested a larger number of residents than were ever observed. Even the rhythm of lights at night told a story, a pattern of discipline, of routine, of deliberate living. Ibrahim, meanwhile, kept doing his job. He likely had no idea he was being tracked. His routes hadn't changed much in years. He delivered letters to known figures in Pakistan's northwest, waited for replies, then returned. But now, at every stop, someone was watching. Still, the CIA hesitated. They had tracked men before. They had been wrong before, but the pattern wouldn't let go. After months of study, analysts were 60 to 80% confident that the tall man inside the Abbottabad compound was bin Laden. Not a guarantee, not even actionable evidence in court. But enough to raise eyebrows all the way to the White House. President Obama was briefed in detail. The intelligence was circumstantial, the analysts admitted, but compelling. If it wasn't bin Laden, it was someone living exactly like him. And if it was bin Laden, this might be the only window they would ever get. But before the raid could be greenlit, they needed more. So the CIA shifted into higher gear. Local assets were recruited to rent safe houses near the compound. They began surveillance on foot, snapping photos, tracking comings and goings, counting children, measuring habits. They collected data on trash disposal, electric usage, even the schedule of the family's livestock. Still, no direct confirmation. No image of bin Laden's face. No recording of his voice. just circumstantial consistency. One tiny moment changed everything. A courier dropped something in the trash too early. It wasn't burned. A piece of packaging, reportedly from a known favourite of bin Laden's diet, found its way into American hands via local operatives. No fingerprint. But a pattern of truth was forming. Meanwhile, inside the compound, Ibrahim continued his routine, unaware, or perhaps simply confident, that he was invisible. Historians still wonder if he ever suspected something. Did he ever feel a gaze he couldn't explain? Did he question why a new neighbour asked too many questions about livestock? Did he wonder why a child on a rooftop seemed to be watching with a little too much interest? Regardless, he said nothing. And he kept walking the same paths, always from the compound to the market, always with a list in his head. Never a phone, never a note, only memory. One night, after returning from a supply run, Ibrahim parked the Suzuki inside the compound gate and locked it behind him, as always. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that American surveillance had recorded every step of that day, every turn of the ignition, every shadow that crossed the rear wall. At Langley, the evidence was mounting. Analysts now placed the odds of bin Laden being inside the compound at more than 90%. There was no photographic proof, no DNA. But the courier's movement, the behaviour inside the house, the physical details, all pointed to the same impossible answer. Osama bin Laden, the architect of 9/11, the symbol of terror, the ghost of modern warfare, was hiding in a 3-story house beside a military base in Pakistan. And his life, his entire network, depended on one man walking groceries through a metal gate. That man had just made a mistake. The final stage began quietly. More surveillance, more maps, teams briefed. A mission slowly forming, far away in Virginia and DC, while in Abbottabad, goats munched grass, children whispered prayers, and the walls stayed stubbornly still. Bin Laden remained in his top-floor room, oblivious to the growing danger. He continued writing letters, playing with his youngest children, sipping tea with Amal on quiet afternoons. In one draft letter, found later, he mused about relocating to another city. The world was shifting, he wrote. Security might require a new home. Perhaps Karachi. Perhaps a smaller house, less conspicuous. He never made the move. By the time the Americans finished tracking Ibrahim, the decision had already been made. A SEAL team would go in. No airstrike, no missile. They wanted proof. They wanted a body. And all of it, every helicopter blade, every bullet, every last whisper, would hinge on Ibrahim and the silent trail he didn't know he left behind. Inside the walled silence of the Abbottabad compound, while drones circled far above and strangers outside pretended not to stare, Osama bin Laden lived by a rhythm so measured, so obsessively controlled, it bordered on ritual. If the rest of Al-Qaeda was splintering into chaotic limbs, the man at the centre remained still, a figure of routine, of structure, of slow-burning patience. His day began before dawn. Each morning, bin Laden rose well before the first call to prayer, often waking the rest of the house with the gentle creak of his door and the soft shuffle of sandals. He'd perform ablutions in a small washroom near his bedroom, then descend into a private moment of stillness. No electronics, no conversations, just whispered recitations and long stretches of meditation. After prayer, he would engage in a kind of rudimentary exercise. His routines were never elaborate. He wasn't lifting weights or doing push-ups, but they were consistent. He often paced in tight loops across his bedroom, walking slowly but deliberately for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. On good days, he'd complete hundreds of paces, the concrete beneath his sandals slowly smoothing beneath the repetition. Later, during the compound raid, investigators noticed the distinct path of wear in his bedroom carpet. A looped trail, soft and faded. That's where he walked, every day, for years, like a lion in a zoo. Breakfast followed, though it was always simple. Dates, flatbread, and sometimes a boiled egg or a bit of honey. Bin Laden had a fondness for local honey which he believed had curative properties. He'd sip it with warm water, seated on a mat or small cushion. Occasionally his youngest son or daughter would join him, sitting quietly nearby while he ate. Conversation was minimal. This was not a man of chatter. What came next was his most productive time. For several hours each morning, bin Laden wrote long letters to commanders, responses to allies, critiques of Al-Qaeda branches, even advice for family members. His handwriting was small, precise, almost cramped, reflecting the tight space of his world. Pages filled with strategy, ideology, and corrections stacked neatly on a desk that never saw daylight. He read, too, books on geopolitics, Islamic law, military history. He had an oddly eclectic library. Dozens of titles found later range from classics of Islamic scholarship to fringe conspiracy treatises. Among them, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, Bloodlines of the Illuminati, and Obama's Wars. One of his more unexpected favourites was a book on the collapse of the US financial system, a subject he hoped would one day unravel his greatest enemy from the inside. Despite the absence of the internet, bin Laden was unusually informed. Couriers brought him videos on USB drives, lectures, news reports, even foreign documentaries. He would watch them on an old TV connected only to a DVD player, curtains drawn tight, the room dark except for the glow of the screen. One CIA analyst after the raid would call it the strangest home theatre in the world. Occasionally bin Laden made notes while watching. Sometimes he paused the video, turned to his notebook, and scribbled thoughts about drone warfare, global finance, or the spiritual decline of Western civilization. Then he'd resume, sipping tea, absorbing every frame. Lunch was taken late, often in silence, usually lentils, rice and flatbread, occasionally with yogurt or pickled vegetables. He insisted on frugality. He told his family they must not grow soft in comfort. Even in hiding, even with access to stored cash, he believed discipline must extend to the plate. Eating was not indulgence, it was fuel. After the midday meal and prayers, he rested. For an hour or two each day, he napped, usually alone in his room. The door closed, the compound hushed, the windows layered in blankets or blackout boards. Outside, chickens pecked in the courtyard. Children played in whispered tones. The ghost upstairs slept. Afternoons were more flexible. He might take time to see his children, to answer their questions, to share a story from Islamic history. Once a week he held informal religious instruction for the older boys, using handwritten notes and worn-out printouts passed from courier to courier over the years. The teachings were theological, sure, but also deeply strategic. He emphasized resistance, patience, planning, and a willingness to endure hardship. This was not casual parenting. It was generational indoctrination wrapped in bedtime stories. Evenings were spent writing again, often responding to messages brought by Ibrahim or reviewing news reports from the outside world. He'd reflect on events, an uprising in Tunisia, a drone strike in Yemen, a political shift in the West, and compose responses with an eerie sense of detachment, like a man playing chess by mail with an opponent he no longer recognized. Despite the starkness of his life, bin Laden was strangely hopeful in these writings. He believed the Arab Spring might be the moment the Muslim world reclaimed its narrative. He encouraged patience, advised against immediate attacks, and envisioned a world where Al-Qaeda became less a military force and more a vanguard for ideological awakening. Our words, he wrote, must strike deeper than our swords. That optimism didn't extend to technology. In letter after letter, he warned his followers never to use email, phones, or digital media. He believed all such channels were compromised. Even your silence, he wrote once, can be tracked. This deep mistrust even led him to consider rebranding Al-Qaeda altogether. He wanted a name that sounded less militant, more theological. His suggestion, Group for Monotheism and Jihad. It never caught on. At night, after final prayers, the compound fell quiet again. Lights dimmed, doors shut. Bin Laden would read by lamplight or recite passages of the Quran softly to himself. His wives settled into their separate quarters. Children whispered themselves to sleep, clutching stories instead of toys. The silence was thick, dense enough to feel, and still his mind churned. He worried constantly about his image, not in the narcissistic sense, but as a historical figure. He was deeply aware of his place in jihadist history. He fretted that his legacy might be diluted by infighting, by violence against civilians, by ideological drift. He even feared being forgotten. In a draft message, he instructed his son Hamza not just to study the Quran, but to memorize speeches given by his father, to recite them, to keep the flame alive. It was part dynasty building, part desperation. He also worried about betrayal. One of the wives might grow tired of hiding, a courier might get careless, a neighbour might ask the wrong question. The compound, built to disappear, was beginning to fray at the edges. Little things, the shape of the building, the satellite photos, the noise from children, added up. Still, he clung to his belief that Allah would shield him. It wasn't arrogance, exactly. It was faith. He believed that surviving drone strikes, wars, and a global manhunt for a decade meant something. He saw signs in everything, in dreams, in bird migrations, in small coincidences. One wife recalled how he once interpreted the unusual blooming of a plant as a message of divine favour. Another noted that he wouldn't allow birds to be harmed in the courtyard, fearing they carried omens. And in those moments, you see the full paradox of the man. He was calculating yet mystical. He was isolated but obsessed with global events. He was a hermit with delusions of empire, and he still believed he had time. What he didn't know was that the courier had already made the mistake, that satellites had already locked onto the roof, that far away in a windowless room in Langley, strangers were watching his shadow pace the same loop he had walked every morning for 6 years. And they were making plans. Soon he'd break the morning silence with the soft creak of his door, step into his exercise circle and begin pacing once more, unaware that somewhere men in suits and uniforms were watching him from the sky. Not just watching, waiting. In the cold machinery of modern surveillance, few things are as telling as the absence of noise. Silence can speak volumes. To the CIA analysts poring over the Abbottabad compound's data feeds, the near-complete digital blackout radiating from the house was not just odd, it was revolutionary in its clarity. In an age where even refrigerators send signals, a house that says nothing is the loudest voice in the room. By the start of 2011, the compound had become the most scrutinised house in the world. But not through microphones or hacked emails. There were none to hack. The silence of the residents, their meticulous routine, and the absolute absence of electronic emissions made them more conspicuous, not less. Osama bin Laden had engineered the most extreme form of digital detox in modern history. There were no phones, no Wi-Fi routers, no computers emitting even the smallest electromagnetic blip. Even battery-powered devices were rare. Bin Laden wrote by hand, read paper books, and avoided even the most basic appliances that could be intercepted or tracked. The only screen in his orbit was an old television connected to a DVD player. No satellite signal, no antenna, just discs, passed in by courier like sacred relics. This low-tech fortress was built not just to withstand detection, but to erase the very footprints that modern life leaves behind. No pings, no posts, no patterns. And yet, even in this vacuum, information seeped in. Bin Laden's window to the world came primarily through USB drives. His couriers would collect data, digital versions of newspapers, audio files, documentaries, speeches, news segments, and jihadist propaganda, and deliver it on flash drives smuggled in under layers of clothing or hidden inside everyday items. The drives were plugged into a laptop inside the compound, which was never connected to the internet. It operated like a hermit's library, a digital monastery. From these files, bin Laden would gather reports about drone strikes, military operations, political speeches, and market collapses. He had his finger pressed to the pulse of the world, albeit delayed and second-hand. One intelligence officer later remarked that his awareness of global politics was shockingly accurate for a man who hadn't seen a browser window since 2001. And yet, what he did with that information was uniquely personal. He didn't just consume it, he annotated it. He reacted to it in letters. He debated it in monologues that were never heard. When watching videos of American politicians, he would occasionally pause the footage and mutter under his breath. When hearing of drone strikes, he would sit silently for long stretches, hands clasped in contemplation. One video recovered after the raid showed him watching himself on TV. It was footage of an old broadcast, grainy, triumphant post-9/11. He sat cross-legged in front of the screen, chin resting on his hand, watching his younger self rage against America. No sound escaped his lips. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just watched. Maybe remembering, maybe mourning. He was in many ways trapped in an information loop of his own design. He didn't trust the media, yet he relied on it. He criticised Western analysis, yet read it religiously. In one recovered letter, he wrote that the Zionist Crusader Alliance controlled public opinion, but still referenced their polling data in strategic decisions. He kept tabs on the Arab Spring, especially the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt. He saw them as signs that the Muslim world was awakening, not necessarily because of Al-Qaeda, but as part of a larger divine tide. He encouraged his followers to support the uprisings, but warned against taking credit. Let the people believe it was their own doing, he advised. Victory is not always claimed by the hand that shaped it, he wrote. And all of this, his awareness, his strategy, his philosophy, was filtered through a digital system that hadn't evolved past 2002. While the world moved into the era of smartphones, social media, and 24-hour analytics, bin Laden retreated deeper into handwritten letters and USB drives. In some ways, it preserved him. In others, it isolated him entirely. His mistrust extended even to photographs. He banned cameras from the compound. He never allowed his image to be captured, even by his children. One wife later admitted that she hadn't seen a picture of him smiling in years, not because he never did, but because it was forbidden to record. Identity was a vulnerability, and his was too powerful to risk. Even the books in his library were curated with care. He read about encryption, espionage, and the psychology of warfare. He owned guides on hacking, even though he had no computer to use them. It was as if he were preparing for a battle he could no longer fight, hoping that someday someone else would carry the knowledge forward. Among his most unusual possessions was a document titled Why Nations Fail, which explored the roots of economic collapse and political instability. Beside it was a handwritten margin note, Replace corruption with Sharia. The question mark was underlined twice. These glimpses into his intellectual world paint a surreal picture. A man cut off from modern tools but still attempting to orchestrate global movements. A hermit with an empire of thoughts, whispered into letters and passed from hand to hand. But perhaps the most revealing quirk of his detox lifestyle was how much he resented the technology he also depended on. In one letter, he warned his followers never to carry phones. A phone in your pocket is an agent in your pocket, he wrote. You speak through it, and the enemy listens through it. You carry it, and the drones follow. He was right, of course, and yet that obsession with security came at a cost. The very strategies that protected him also severed him from real-time leadership. His orders reached the battlefield weeks late. His opinions on operations arrived after the blood had dried. He was out of sync and increasingly irrelevant. One of his final documents outlined a plan to strike US targets on specific dates. He wanted to coordinate attacks with the anniversaries of past victories. But the affiliates he sent these ideas to never followed through, not because they disagreed, but because they no longer needed him. His voice had become symbolic, revered, yes, but not operational. The digital silence that once shielded him was slowly becoming his prison. Inside the compound, even his family began to feel it. Children asked why they couldn't watch cartoons like the neighbours. Wives wondered why they couldn't listen to recorded recitations from the mosque. There were no phones, no radios, not even a clock that ticked loudly. It was all muted. And when the courier would return with new USB drives, the arrival was treated like a holiday. Bin Laden would sit with his notepad, press play, and lose himself in the images. The wars, the protests, the faces of enemies and allies alike. Then, when it was over, he'd shut off the screen, return to his pad, and write letters that might never be read. There's a peculiar irony here. For a man who inspired one of the most media-saturated events in modern history, bin Laden had built himself a life free from all the tools that carried his message. No keyboard, no camera, no microphone, just ink, just whispers. And that silence, so carefully preserved, was beginning to betray him. Because elsewhere, where the signals flowed freely, his enemies had noticed that the house said nothing, that no one inside texted, emailed, or posted, that in a world defined by noise, this silence was deafening. In the back room of the Abbottabad compound, behind drawn curtains and layers of secrecy, Osama bin Laden wrote letters that would never reach their intended recipients. Some were addressed to sons he hadn't seen in years. Others were composed for the leaders of Al-Qaeda's far-flung branches, men who still claimed his name but had begun forging their own paths, sometimes with violence and tactics that he viewed as recklessly divisive. In the compound's growing stillness, this letter-writing became both therapy and legacy management. He pored over drafts, correcting grammar, reworking sentences for emphasis, sometimes starting from scratch when the tone felt wrong. The letters were rarely emotional, but always deliberate. They were filled with observations about world events, spiritual guidance, and subtle chastisements cloaked in formal language. A few letters read like ideological manifestos, dense with citations from the Quran, interwoven with political strategy. Others were deeply personal. In one, he warned his sons not to join the battlefield too early, that the time for martyrdom would come, but not before they had been educated, trained, and purified in thought. He seemed torn between preparing them for holy war and protecting them from the very path he had walked. Many of these letters never left the compound. They were stored, wrapped in cloth, or placed inside plastic bags for future couriers. Some he kept in a stack beside his writing mat. Others were hidden in old books, placed with eerie care among conspiracy texts and Islamic scholarship. He seemed to suspect that time might run out before they were delivered. He also maintained what could only be called a strategic diary, a running record of thoughts on the shifting landscape of jihadist politics. He lamented the rise of what he saw as rogue affiliates, especially in Yemen and Iraq, who had begun targeting civilians indiscriminately. In one passage he wrote, "These actions tarnish the name we have worked for. The sword must be precise, not wild." He feared that Al-Qaeda's image, once cloaked in religious righteousness, had begun to rot into brutality. A striking moment comes in a draft letter addressed to Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born cleric and propagandist whose videos had galvanized a younger Western audience. Bin Laden both praised and warned him, "Do not become intoxicated by your own echo. The audience you gain in America must hear truth, not just volume." He obsessed over language. Words to him were weapons more powerful than explosives. He believed the war for hearts and minds was the most enduring one, and he crafted his arguments like a teacher drawing diagrams in the sand. "A confused believer," he once wrote, "can do more damage than a determined enemy." There was also a surprising concern about image and branding. Yes, branding. In one recovered document, Bin Laden proposed that Al-Qaeda change its name altogether, believing the existing label had become too associated with mindless violence and public fear. He floated alternatives, none particularly catchy, but all rooted in religious framing. "Monotheism and Jihad movement," he wrote. "Al-Tawheed Vanguard." It read like a struggling CEO trying to rescue a dying brand. And in a way, that's what he was. But amid the ideological writings, there were fragments of eccentricity too. One letter described the compound's chickens in some detail, noting their behaviour and egg production. He advised Amal, his youngest wife, on a new method for watering the garden, based on something he'd read in an agricultural pamphlet smuggled in from Pakistan's Ministry of Agriculture. Another memo included a list of things to buy for the compound: more tea, soap, and hair dye, black. That last one stood out for obvious reasons. During one video recovered after the raid, Bin Laden appears with his famously dark beard freshly dyed, seated beneath a grey wool blanket. The contrast between the jet black beard and the aging, tired face behind it is jarring. Vanity or symbolism? Possibly both. A dark beard was a symbol of strength, youth, and righteous command. He may have wanted to appear strong in the eyes of future viewers, or in the mirror for himself. Another oddity, he kept clippings. Not just articles passed in by courier, but actual physical clippings, pages from magazines and newspapers, sometimes with scribbled notes in the margins. One of his favourites seemed to be about the collapse of the US housing market. He underlined phrases like credit default swap and structural instability. He appeared to view economic fragility in the West as confirmation of divine justice. But it wasn't just about vengeance. Bin Laden genuinely believed that a collapsing Western system would create space for Islamic governance to rise. He saw the world in epochs, and in his writings, America was already entering its twilight, brittle, arrogant, stretched too thin. He believed his job now was to write the next blueprint. This belief infused his letters with a strange optimism. He encouraged patience. He warned followers not to launch attacks in the short term. "Let the enemy choke on its own contradictions," he wrote. "Wait for the moment when even their own people question their power." It's an oddly passive strategy for a man so associated with violence, but it reveals the shift that had taken place in his thinking. Bin Laden, in hiding, had become a strategist of erosion, not explosion. And yet, Not all of his letters were strategic or high-minded. Some were deeply intimate. A note to Amal included instructions for his burial, that he wished to be buried in unmarked earth, washed by family with no announcement to the world. In another, he told his daughters to be steadfast, patient and educated. He said the struggle would not always be fought with rifles, but with pens and voices. In perhaps his strangest letter, he composed an essay on dream interpretation. He had studied Islamic teachings on dreams, and had come to believe that visions seen during sleep could guide action. One wife claimed he once cancelled a message delivery after dreaming of birds scattering into the sky. A sign, he told her, that watchers are near. There were other dreams too, ones he didn't share in writing. But from second-hand accounts given by family members, it seems he had nightmares of soldiers, of betrayal, of falling buildings, and occasionally of Mecca surrounded by flames. Back in the real world, his thoughts remained sharp but increasingly disconnected. While he criticised Al-Qaeda in Iraq for its brutality, ISIS was already forming in the ideological slipstream he helped create. While he urged careful planning and delayed strikes, lone actors across the globe were already turning his ideas into impulsive violence. His control was slipping, not just physically but philosophically. Still, he kept writing. In one letter, he instructed a courier to tell his sons not to seek fame. "If the world knows your face before it knows your words," he wrote, "then you have already failed." Another included a list of possible safe houses in other cities, should the compound be compromised. He marked Abbottabad as secure for now. But there was also something else, something more fragile. Among the stacks of strategic memos and doctrinal essays, one small letter stood out. It was addressed to no one, just a reflection, a meditation. In it, bin Laden wrote, "My name is known to the world, but not to the birds in the trees. I hear them every morning. I do not know what they say to each other, but they are not afraid of me." It was strange, almost poetic. The words of a man who had transformed global history, now reflecting on birdsong like a monk in exile. Perhaps even he in his final years wondered what all the noise had been for. That letter, never sent, was folded and tucked between the pages of a book titled The Ethics of the Prophet. It was found near his sleeping mat during the raid, untouched, a whisper in ink, in a house full of shadows. The days bled into each other at the Abbottabad compound, a slow drip of repetition, made heavier by the echo chamber of bin Laden's isolation. But outside those thick walls, change moved like a current. Across the Arab world, protest rose from Cairo to Benghazi. Regimes teetered. Youth in the streets shouted for freedom, not under banners of Al-Qaeda, but under flags of democracy, nationalism, and sometimes even secularism. Bin Laden watched it all unfold from a cushion on the third floor, the flicker of revolution washing across his old television screen. He was both captivated and unsettled. The uprisings were reshaping the very region he had long tried to influence, but not through violence, not under his name, and certainly not with the religiosity he had spent his life espousing. In a series of unsent letters, he reflected on these events. "The people have awakened," he wrote, "but they walk without compass." He worried the movements lacked spiritual guidance, that without Islam at their centre, the revolutions would crumble or be hijacked by Western interests. Yet, he also saw opportunity. In another letter, he called the Arab Spring a divine breeze, and encouraged his followers to support the protests, but subtly. "Do not claim leadership," he warned. "Let the people breathe freedom before you ask them to kneel." This internal conflict, hope and anxiety, inspiration and frustration, coloured his entire approach in those final months. He was watching a wave rise that he didn't control, but desperately wanted to harness. Ironically, while the outside world burst into movement, bin Laden's life had never been more static. He still rose before dawn, still walked the loops of his bedroom, still ate quietly with Amal and their youngest children, still reviewed USB drives, still scrawled letters, still folded them into bundles wrapped in cloth. But now an undercurrent of tension ran through the house. The courier, Ibrahim, was returning from his trip slightly more nervous. The wives spoke in hushed tones. A child overheard a whispered prayer asking for protection not just from the disbelievers, but from those who knock in the night. The compound was growing uneasy. Bin Laden himself was not blind to the risk. In his letters, he frequently speculated about American drones, about spies, informants, double agents. He even sketched out in meticulous handwriting a plan for evacuation. The family had assigned escape routes that often ended in ditches or goat pens meant to buy just enough time to flee. There was a stash of cash, euros and Pakistani rupees, hidden in various spots around the house. Each wife had a small emergency bag. Children were instructed to hide, to lie still, to play deaf and mute if approached. The whole routine was a daily rehearsal for the unthinkable. And yet, in the face of this growing awareness, the rhythm never truly broke. That was part of the strangeness. Despite everything, the rising tension, the signs, the whispers, Bin Laden stayed. He continued to believe the compound was safe, that its proximity to the military academy made it invisible, that his discipline, his prayers, his silence would shield him. He never took a single step outside the compound during his entire stay, not to walk, not to stretch, not even to look at the stars. Instead, he continued to monitor the world from his private perch. He tracked drone strikes with obsessive interest, recording the frequency and geography of each hit. He mapped patterns, looking for blind spots. He read analysis from think tanks and foreign newspapers, trying to reverse engineer the enemy's thinking. His curiosity was insatiable, but always confined to the frame of a 13-inch television. There's an odd moment described by a courier later on. Bin Laden, after watching a documentary on the financial collapse, reportedly paused the video and said, "This is how empires fall, not by the sword, but by excess." He then returned to his notebook and began scribbling furiously. A leader in exile, philosophizing by lamplight while the world outside trembled on its own axis. At one point he considered issuing a statement about the revolutions. He drafted a message celebrating the fall of dictators, urging Muslims to remain vigilant against Western infiltration. But he never released it. Perhaps he feared revealing his location. Or perhaps, deep down, he realized the world had moved on without him. One historian later suggested that Bin Laden's greatest fear in his final years wasn't death, it was irrelevance. That the world he had tried to ignite had turned into something else entirely. Not jihad, not caliphate, but something messier, more human, less predictable. And maybe that's why he kept writing. In a letter to one of his surviving sons, he emphasized the importance of patience. "Do not rush to be known," he wrote. "Fame is a blade that cuts the hand that holds it." In another, he encouraged the study of law and language, for the next war may be fought with minds, not bullets. These letters were not just instruction, they were inheritance, a paper legacy to a family he knew might be left alone to interpret his mission, or to escape it entirely. Meanwhile, in the house, the ordinary mingled with the surreal. Children memorized Quran verses while a rooster pecked at crumbs near the garden. Wives argued over laundry or sugar, then turned silently to prayer. One child fashioned a toy from a bottle cap and some string. Another tried to mimic his father's pacing, walking small circles in the corridor until told to stop. The house had become its own world, a fragile simulation of domestic life perched on the edge of history. One morning, Bin Laden asked for a new batch of tea to be ordered. He wanted the spiced blend he remembered from his youth, a small comfort. Later that afternoon, he wrote a memo suggesting Al-Qaeda develop a code of ethics for its regional branches, guidelines for conduct to avoid alienating potential supporters. The two notes were folded the same way, placed in the same box. To him, they were part of the same vision. Still, fear began to seep in. During the night, one of the children claimed to see shadows on the roof. Another time, Amal reported hearing a strange hum overhead. Bin Laden dismissed both, though he asked Ibrahim to sweep the compound for signs of intrusion. There were none, at least none that they could see. But the watchers were already there. CIA drones had mapped the compound dozens of times. A safe house had been rented nearby. Cameras and microphones were gathering data. Analysts were reviewing laundry patterns. And the pacer, the tall figure seen during limited hours on the third-floor balcony, was now believed with 95% certainty to be Osama bin Laden. They still had no photograph, no voice recording, just patterns, just routines, just silence. But the silence was its own admission. In a world where everyone speaks, the man who says nothing is often the one who matters most. Back inside the compound, bin Laden was writing again. His last letter, it seems, was a message to his followers not to celebrate the anniversary of 9/11. "We must not become like those we oppose," he wrote. "There is no honour in grief." It was a strange, quiet pivot. Not repentance exactly, but something more reflective. Perhaps he sensed what was coming, or perhaps he believed, until the very end, that the walls would hold. As spring deepened in Abbottabad, the compound remained unchanged on the surface. Chickens clucked at sunrise. Bread was kneaded in silence. A child marked a growth chart scratched faintly on a wall, hoping someone might notice. Yet something in the air had shifted, an imperceptible tension that moved like dust through the corridors. It wasn't a scream. It was a whisper. Of eyes unseen, of ears pressed gently to the quiet. Bin Laden had lived in hiding for so long that the abnormal had become normal. A door never left open, curtains that never moved, a knock that never came. These weren't choices, they were rules, as fixed as gravity. Yet within that pattern, small deviations had begun to creep in. It started subtly. One evening a child pointed to the sky and asked about a star that blinked too fast. It wasn't a star, it was a drone. They were too high to hear, but their presence, small dots drifting far above, was real, and becoming more frequent. On another day, Amal mentioned seeing a stranger in the neighbourhood who walked slowly past the house, twice. He didn't stop, didn't stare, just lingered, long enough to notice, long enough to wonder. Bin Laden, upon hearing this, didn't panic. He grew quiet. He had grown cautious, but not frantic. He considered ordering a relocation, something he had toyed with before. The plan was to eventually leave Abbottabad, perhaps move to Karachi, or a rural village where people asked fewer questions. But he also knew that leaving carried its own risks. In motion, he could be seen. In motion, he could be followed. The walls, though confining, still offered certainty. Besides, there were always rumours. Every safe house had ghosts. Every movement carried paranoia. He had survived decades in the shadows by trusting very little, including his own instincts. Yet what he couldn't see was that it was not his instincts failing him. It was the very strategy he had built. Silence had once been his strength. Now it was the clearest sound. And the watchers, distant, methodical, had begun to decipher the rhythms of his invisibility. Back in Langley, the CIA's surveillance of the compound had entered its most intense phase. The man known only as the Pacer had been seen again, strolling under the overhang of the upper balcony, always at the same hour, always the same path. He was tall, lean, with a distinct posture. No face, but a body that fit the profile. Laundry lines became points of analysis. A certain number of garments implied a larger household than observed. Children's clothing was noted. The volume of food deliveries was mapped. Garbage disposal was tracked, despite the residents' care to burn almost everything. But occasionally a courier disposed of something imperfectly. A packaging label, a stray bit of foil, a cigarette stub. It was enough. All of it fed into the dossier. Page after page of behaviours. Every grocery trip, every flicker of movement on the roof, every prayer call heard faintly through audio surveillance. Even the pattern of electric usage was studied. The house ran lean, but lights were switched with such consistency it suggested military discipline. The watchers were certain. This wasn't a normal family. This wasn't a retired trader. And that tall figure, rarely seen, never speaking, could only be one man. The decision to act did not come easily. In Washington, President Obama convened a series of secret meetings. The CIA presented their findings with the caveat, no direct evidence, no DNA, no photograph, just inference, routine, and the certainty of a pattern that could not lie. There was debate. Some argued for a drone strike, clean, fast, low risk. Others, especially within the intelligence community, wanted confirmation. A body, a face, a name carved into flesh. After years of ghost stories, they needed something that wouldn't vanish into conspiracy. The military began planning a raid. SEAL Team 6, the most elite special forces unit in the world, was briefed. A full-scale mock-up of the compound was constructed for rehearsal. Every room measured, every wall mapped, every dog, chicken and sleeping child accounted for. Still, none of this reached bin Laden. Inside the compound, the days ticked on with eerie normalcy. He wrote, He prayed. He discussed theology with Amal. He spoke quietly with Khalid, his son, who remained closest to him. There were no alarms, no locks changed. If he felt danger, he didn't show it. But the dreams began again. Kyria, his elder wife, mentioned them. Visions of birds scattering, of footsteps in water, of fire behind doors. Bin Laden had always taken dreams seriously. He viewed them not as fiction, but as messages, and these messages were darker than before. One night he didn't sleep. He sat on the floor reading the Quran by lamplight. He underlined a verse and kept his hand resting on the page long after he'd finished it. The verse, "And no soul knows what it will earn tomorrow, and no soul knows in what land it will die." Meanwhile, outside, the preparations neared completion. Helicopters were prepped, night vision gear tested, the route planned down to the minute. The raid would take place under cover of darkness, with stealth helicopters designed to avoid radar detection. 2 teams, 36 minutes, 1 objective: confirm and eliminate Osama bin Laden. Still, the residents of the compound carried on. The children played in the courtyard, chasing a makeshift ball. Wives prepared lentils. Amal swept the upper room. The goats grunted quietly, and somewhere a rooster crowed a bit too early, sensing something not quite right in the air. The evening before the raid, bin Laden wrote, "Just another letter, addressed to no one in particular." It was part instruction, part reflection. He reminded his followers to avoid harming innocent Muslims. He criticised the brutality of certain affiliates. He called for patience, for restraint, for wisdom. And in the final lines he asked that his children be raised in faith, not in hatred. It was not a farewell letter, not exactly, but it felt like an ending. Later that night he spoke briefly with Amal. They had tea. She asked if he felt well. He said nothing, just nodded. Then he walked into his room, closed the door, and lay on the floor with a small cushion beneath his head. Outside, a storm gathered, not of weather, but of action. Half a world away, helicopters were lifting into the sky, their rotors silent to human ears, their destination marked. In the compound, the lights dimmed. The children slept. The walls, so tall and so carefully built, held their breath, and inside the ghost waited, unaware that the watchers had already begun to descend. In the dead quiet of the Abbottabad night, the sky held its breath. No clouds, no wind, just a deep, starless stillness that cloaked the rooftops and roads of the sleeping city. Below, the compound was wrapped in its usual silence. No lights shone from its narrow windows. The goats, tethered for the evening, shifted occasionally but made no sound. Inside, children slept on mats and mattresses, their dreams as still as the air outside. And then, from somewhere beyond the horizon, a low tremor began, a vibration too soft for ears, but enough to make the leaves shiver. Operation Neptune's Spear was underway. The SEAL teams had launched from Jalalabad, Afghanistan, under cover of darkness. 2 specially modified Black Hawk helicopters, engineered for stealth and outfitted with radar-dampening panels, raced low across the Pakistani terrain. Their route was calculated to avoid detection from both civilian and military radar. Pakistan's air defence systems, surprisingly formidable, remained unaware. In one of those helicopters sat SEALs hand-picked for their precision, silence, and unflinching calm. Among them, the man who would eventually enter the third-floor bedroom and come face-to-face with a figure he had studied for years. No one aboard spoke much. They had drilled the compound layout dozens of times, each room memorized, each wall internalized. They moved like living blueprints. Back at the CIA, in a small operations room, Director Leon Panetta and President Obama watched the mission unfold via satellite feed. There was no audio, just grainy thermal images and blinking dots moving across a digital map. The moment had arrived, not just for intelligence, but for justice, for closure, or perhaps simply for proof. The helicopters reached Abbottabad just after 1 a.m. local time. As the first approached the compound, turbulence or a misjudged air current caused it to wobble. It descended too quickly and crash-landed within the walls, its tail smacking against the outer boundary. No explosion, no casualties. But the sleek stealth chopper was now a wreck, its shroud of silence ruptured. Inside the compound, chaos bloomed. A boom thundered through the walls, lights flickered, a child screamed. Amal jerked upright, already pulling her headscarf over her hair. Bin Laden was already on his feet, moving barefoot toward the door. "They've come," he said. He didn't shout, didn't panic. He knew. From the rooftop, Khalid, his son, peered down toward the courtyard. Figures moved with eerie precision. Shadows in black, rifles at the ready, voices low and sharp in a language he didn't fully understand. English, fast and urgent. Khalid shouted. Bin Laden told him to stay back. But Khalid didn't listen. He stepped forward, trying to confront the intruders. The first bullet found him before the second sentence ever left his lips. He fell, silent at the top of the stairs. The SEALs moved methodically, just as they had trained. The compound's first floor was cleared within minutes. Women and children were corralled into rooms and zip-tied. One woman lunged, maybe in fear, maybe in defence of her children, and was struck with a non-lethal round to subdue her. Another held a toddler, her hands shaking so violently she could barely keep hold of the child's arm. The SEALs climbed to the second floor. Another man, Abra, the courier's brother, was shot and killed while reaching for something. His wife was wounded by crossfire but survived. Another room cleared, no target yet. On the third floor the team paused. Behind a door, ajar by inches, came soft voices, movement, a shifting shadow. Inside, Bin Laden stood near his bed, Amal at his side. He had not armed himself. There was no rifle, no explosive vest. Only his hands were empty. And yet, to the SEALs, he was a live target. He might have a detonator. He might lunge. They couldn't afford the risk. When they burst into the room, Amal rushed forward instinctively. She was shot in the leg and crumpled to the floor. Bin Laden stood behind her near the edge of the room. He looked at them. One SEAL raised his weapon. Osama bin Laden, he confirmed. Silent to the world outside, but final to the men inside that room. The shot was immediate. Centre mass, followed by one to the head. Bin Laden collapsed near the corner of the room. The man whose name had changed global history, now still and silent for good. The operation wasn't over. The team swept the room, confirmed the kill, and began collecting materials. Hard drives, thumb drives, notebooks, letters. Everything within reach was bagged. On the lower floors, women wept, children screamed, a baby wailed in the arms of a teenage girl. The team moved with clockwork efficiency. They had less than 10 minutes before Pakistani defences could potentially respond. Time was closing in. They attempted to destroy the downed helicopter, planting explosives. The blast lit up the compound with orange fire, sending neighbours running into the streets in confusion. The second helicopter landed inside, and the team loaded the body onto it, zipped into a black bag, unceremonious and exact. Osama bin Laden left the compound the way he had arrived, hidden, quiet, wrapped in shadows. As the SEALs lifted off, the women left behind were screaming. One reached for a curtain and pulled it shut. Another collapsed on the floor beside Khalid's body. The house that had never raised a voice louder than a whisper now rang with cries of grief. Back in Washington, the signal was clear. The SEAL team was en route. No casualties. One loss. The downed chopper. But the mission had succeeded. The president turned from the monitor and took a breath that seemed to last forever. In the hours that followed, news spread slowly. US officials waited for DNA confirmation before making the announcement. Photographs were taken. Gruesome. Clinical. His body was washed according to Islamic rites aboard a US naval vessel and buried at sea, a decision made to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine or a target. And in Abbottabad, the fires in the courtyard slowly went out. The compound stood empty now, its silence broken forever. Neighbours who had ignored the oddities now buzzed with theories. Some claimed they'd known all along. Others said the Americans were lying, that bin Laden had died years earlier. Children in nearby homes whispered about the ghost house, where goats had once walked the same yard as the world's most feared man. And inside, scattered across blood-streaked floors and broken furniture, lay the detritus of an invisible life. Handwritten letters, grocery lists, a child's drawing of a tree, books without covers, a broken television. When the Pakistani authorities entered the compound hours later, they found what the SEALs left behind. Fragments of a myth, now just clutter. Historians still debate whether bin Laden expected the raid. He had told his family what to do in such a moment. But his final posture, unarmed, unspeaking, has sparked endless analysis. Was it surrender? Defiance? Acceptance? Maybe it was none of those. Maybe after 10 years of running, writing, hiding and waiting, he was simply tired. In the days following the raid, the compound at Waziristan Lane, Abbottabad became the most infamous address on earth. Journalists, soldiers, intelligence officers and curious neighbours all converged, forming a strange ecosystem around the now vacant structure. What had been a neighbourhood oddity became a vortex of global attention, and for the people who had lived next to it all those years, the absurdity was just beginning. They spoke of the compound's oddities like a scavenger hunt they hadn't known they were playing. The strange height of the walls, the lack of trash burning, the silence. One man recounted how a cricket ball had once landed over the wall. His son had asked to retrieve it. "Don't bother," he had said. "Those people don't return anything." Inside the compound, Pakistani officials combed through what remained. The SEALs had taken documents, hard drives and selected personal items, but much was left behind. What emerged wasn't a fortress of evil so much as a cluttered, almost ascetic domestic space, one where the mundane collided with the historic. Each room was catalogued, and what they found was stranger than expected. On the third floor, where bin Laden had spent most of his final years, the mattress was thin and laid directly on the floor. A small wooden desk was stacked with handwritten notes and aging books. The carpet was threadbare, marked with the worn oval of his pacing path. Nearby, a television on a stand sat beside a heap of wires and a DVD player. A few labelled discs lay beside it. Some religious lectures, some conspiracy documentaries, one of Noam Chomsky. There was a bag of just-for-men hair dye in the bathroom, toothpaste, a worn comb, bars of soap stacked neatly beside a prayer rug, a small box of Misbahar prayer beads, and a copy of the Quran, bookmarked with a dried flower. It was not the lair of a man preparing for battle. It was the den of someone settling in for forever. In a dusty drawer was a note titled, oddly, "To whomever finds this." The handwriting matched bin Laden's, but it contained nothing dramatic, just a few lines of advice. Trust in God, be gentle to children, die with your eyes open. Elsewhere, investigators found children's toys, homemade dolls, marbles, handwritten flashcards for Arabic grammar lessons. An entire generation had been raised behind those walls, and their presence was everywhere. Crayon marks near light switches, fingerprints on glass panes, half-finished colouring pages under a bed. And the books, over 150 titles in multiple languages, ranging from theology to global politics to fringe science. Among them, the 9/11 Commission Report, Manual of Guerrilla Warfare, Guide to Natural Healing, and American Civil Liberties in Crisis. Some pages were marked, others dog-eared. One book on dream interpretation had a page circled multiple times with a note in the margin. Fire equals purification or warning. These small clues fascinated investigators. They weren't just reading a man's literature, they were reading his psychology, his fears, his hopes, his contradictions. Downstairs, the rooms were smaller and even more sparse. The children had slept on mats or thin mattresses. Toys were few. Books were handwritten or printed in bulk, works of Islamic scholarship and memorization guides. In one corner, officials found a cardboard box filled with letters that had never been delivered. Some were open, some sealed. A few were addressed to leaders of Al-Qaeda branches who were by then either dead or no longer loyal. Outside, in the courtyard, there was a small patch of garden. Wilted herbs, a few scraggly stalks of okra, a rusting shovel. Nearby, a tethered cow was gone, but its feeding trough remained, half filled with grain. The animals had been left behind. The surviving family members, wives, children, were taken into Pakistani custody and questioned for weeks. Their accounts, though fragmentary, began to paint a picture of life behind the walls, and what they described was both chilling and oddly mundane. He was always writing, one wife said, always pacing, always thinking. He was quiet, said a daughter, but he would smile when he saw my drawings. The bin of hair dye would become a meme almost immediately. News outlets around the world, breathless with the need to humanize or ridicule the once feared leader, seized on the irony. Osama dyed his beard. Even fugitives care about roots. But in truth it wasn't vanity. It was symbolism. The black beard signified youth, strength, spiritual readiness. In martyrdom mythology, it mattered. Even the DVDs sparked interest. Analysts found one labelled Tom and Jerry, another Charlie Bit My Finger, although whether bin Laden watched them is unclear. What became evident was that life inside the compound had not been frozen in fear. It was shaped by it, yes, but still lived. Children laughed. Meals were cooked. Chores were done. Prayers were whispered in bedrooms that smelled of cumin and damp concrete. Meanwhile, around the world, the news of bin Laden's death took hold like a wildfire of disbelief. In America, crowds gathered in Times Square outside the White House, in front of firehouses in New York, cheering and waving flags. For many, the moment was cathartic. 10 years after September 11th, the ghost was finally gone. Justice had arrived, not through a courtroom, but a bullet. Yet for others, questions bloomed. Why no trial? Why bury him at sea? What if it wasn't him? Conspiracy theories multiplied before the ink on the headlines had dried. Some believed it had all been faked. Others claimed he had died years earlier. A few simply refused to believe he could be dead at all. Even within his own movement, reactions varied. Some mourned him as a martyr. Others criticised him for abandoning the battlefield. A few saw his death as a sign to pivot, to move beyond bin Ladenism into something new, something more ruthless. Historians would later mark his final years as a period of increasing irrelevance. While he'd imagined himself shaping the future of global jihad through letters and strategy, his followers had long since shifted gears. Groups like ISIS would later discard his restraint entirely, choosing spectacle and terror over the quiet calculations bin Laden favoured in his last days. But in that room, with the worn carpet and the half-finished letter on the floor, none of that mattered. The man had been real. He had breathed, written, eaten, raised children, prayed, aged. He had gone from sandstorms in Tora Bora to domestic stillness in suburban Pakistan. His final years were not cinematic. They were repetitive, dusty, even gentle. And that may be the strangest legacy of all. Because for a figure wrapped in fire and fury, bin Laden died as quietly as he had lived, hiding behind walls, scribbling notes no one would read, in a house where the light bulbs flickered and the garden grew too wild to trim. In the pitch-black silence before the helicopters arrived, in those last undisturbed minutes, Osama bin Laden might have believed the world had finally forgotten him. Not in disgrace, but in stasis, a stillness born from survival. After all, his letters had grown quieter, more introspective. His voice, once dominant in jihadi messaging, had faded into a distant echo. The war he had set into motion had shapeshifted, far beyond his reach. But when the SEALs touched down, that illusion evaporated in the heat of rotor blades and bootsteps. After the raid, what the SEALs left behind wasn't just the quiet shell of a household. It was a puzzle box of revelations, absurdities and contradictions. From the outside, bin Laden's existence looked like one of hardened zealotry. But as intelligence officers sifted through his belongings and writings, they found a far more complicated portrait. Part recluse, part strategist, part patriarch, part ghost. One agent described it like walking into the office of a retired professor who still thinks he's running the university. Papers were everywhere, neatly stacked, often annotated, but rarely organised beyond categories that made sense only to him. In the drawer of his desk were 3 sets of notes, one about recommended reading for his children, another outlining a theoretical media strategy for Al-Qaeda affiliates in the event of a Western collapse, and a third, scribbled on the back of a grocery list, exploring what he called digital jihad through computer viruses and psychological manipulation. He had no internet, but his mind was still online, and in the corner of his bedroom beneath his prayer mat a smaller set of notes was found. These were different, less tactical, more personal. One described a dream in which he wandered through a garden of white birds, each whispering the name of one of his sons. Another mused about forgiveness, not offered, but hoped for. "If I'm wrong, let it be shown on the day of meeting," he had written. His family, particularly Amal, his youngest wife, would later describe the days leading up to the raid as strangely calm. He had become quieter, spent more time near the windows, though never fully visible. He reread old books, sat longer in prayer. One night, she awoke to find him weeping. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silently, with his hand resting on a photo of one of his sons killed years earlier in Afghanistan. It was as if, on some deep level, he knew. But perhaps the strangest detail emerged from the simplest habit. Bin Laden had a routine of organising his letters at the end of each week. Not by content, but by importance. He used small coloured thread to tie them. Red for urgent, green for ideological, blue for personal. The colours were faint, sometimes reused, but always meaningful. On the day of the raid, the red stack was on his desk. The blue was under his mattress. And in that blue pile was a letter addressed to his daughters. It read, in part, "The world will not know you as I have. They will not see your gentleness, your questions, your faith. But remember, no deed is ever lost. Not the good, not the evil. It all arrives in the end." That note would never reach them. Outside the compound, the world began digesting the news. The announcement by President Obama on the night of May 1st, 2011, was solemn but triumphant. Osama bin Laden had been killed in a US Special Forces operation. The body had been recovered. Justice, in the eyes of many, had finally arrived. But with that announcement came an avalanche of reactions. In the United States, celebrations erupted in major cities. Crowds waved flags, chanted in unison, danced in the streets. For a country still bearing the psychological bruises of 9/11, it felt like a long-delayed exhale. Firefighters gathered near Ground Zero and rang bells in tribute. College students sprinted to the White House lawn chanting, "USA! USA!" In other corners of the world, the reaction was more nuanced. Many world leaders expressed support. Others questioned the legality of the raid. Some accused the US of violating Pakistan's sovereignty, an argument that would continue to echo in diplomatic circles for months. In parts of the Middle East and South Asia, conspiracy theories blossomed. Some claimed bin Laden had been dead for years. Others insisted he was still alive, and the Americans had faked the entire event to cover up their own failures. Pakistan itself was caught in a geopolitical chokehold. Its military and intelligence services scrambled to explain how bin Laden had lived undetected less than a mile from their top military academy. Some officials feigned ignorance, others deflected. Protests erupted across the country, some condemning the US raid, others demanding answers from their own government. Behind closed doors, international intelligence agencies began re-evaluating their priorities. The raid had provided not just a body, but a treasure trove of data. USBs, journals, letters, passwords, contact lists. It was, one analyst said, the biggest single cache of counter-terrorism intelligence in a decade. And what they found stunned even the most cynical. Bin Laden had written to potential allies outside the jihadi sphere. Leftist revolutionaries, anti-capitalist movements, even anarchist writers. He wasn't just trying to lead a movement, he was trying to build a coalition of grievance. He wanted the entire world's discontent to flow through the ideological funnel of his vision. He had ideas for media manipulation, ways to hack public perception. He studied corporate branding. He took notes on Apple's marketing. He asked, in one letter, whether a jihadi anthem should have a softer refrain to appeal to youth. It was bizarre, it was modern, it was terrifying, and yet, for all that ambition, he lived and died in a house with no phone line, no internet, and no working air conditioning. The discrepancy between his global influence and his cloistered reality fascinated the intelligence community. He was a man who had changed the world, and then hidden from it. A man who hated Western materialism but obsessed over Western systems. A father who taught his children to never trust a stranger. And a man who trusted no one beyond his compound walls. Even among jihadists, his legacy began to shift. In the months after his death, leaders of Al-Qaeda's regional branches issued statements mourning him, praising his vision. But behind the scenes, there were murmurings. Some saw his final years as wasted, a time when the movement needed fire, and he gave them parchment. Others believed he had grown too cautious, too disconnected, too consumed by legacy. A few, especially those who would go on to form ISIS, dismissed him entirely. To them, bin Laden was a first step. Important, yes, but soft, compromised, unwilling to spill the blood they now considered necessary. Bin Laden had become an ancestor, not a leader, revered, but no longer followed. Back in Abbottabad, the compound stood empty, its walls still echoing the last footfalls of the man who once believed he had built a fortress against time. Eventually, Pakistani authorities demolished the house. Bulldozers reduced it to rubble in a single day. Dust choked the air and curious children picked at the debris, searching for treasure. A chunk of wall here, a scorched doorframe there. Someone even claimed to find a scrap of paper with Arabic writing. It turned out to be part of a grocery list. The land was cleared. The story moved on. But the legacy, messy, complicated, unresolved, remained. For a decade, Osama bin Laden had existed in the margins, a ghostly headline who continued to shape war and policy from a concrete cell. He believed himself chosen. He believed the silence that surrounded him was protection, not isolation. In the end, it was neither. It was just silence. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, the compound felt like a time capsule cracked open too soon. The Pakistani officials who entered after the SEALs described it less as a battlefield and more as a surreal museum of a life paused in place. Blood had dried on the third floor, but elsewhere slippers were still neatly placed by doorways. A pot of lentils, half prepared, sat on a stove that had cooled hours before. A child's toy, a makeshift horse sculpted from cardboard and rubber bands, rested under a chair, untouched. The SEAL team had done their job swiftly and precisely. They were in and out in less than 40 minutes. In that time, they killed bin Laden, secured intelligence materials, neutralized opposition, and recovered what would become one of the largest troves of information ever seized from a single high-value target. What they left behind, however, was almost as telling. The compound's second and third floors were the main focus of investigators. Osama bin Laden's bedroom was found exactly as it had been at the moment of the raid. The bloodstains on the floor, the mattress pushed slightly askew, the television still plugged in. A bag of personal effects, likely one of the go bags prepared for escape, was discovered near the wall. It contained currency, a few identification papers, and a handwritten list of phone numbers for people who likely no longer used those phones. His clothing was modest: a long white tunic, a brown shawl, and a dark wool cap. His closet contained no military uniforms, no designer clothes, no combat gear, just a few folded garments, a stack of prayer rugs, and a tin of medicinal balm labelled in Urdu. Nearby was a plastic crate filled with batteries, candles, notebooks, and prayer beads. And then there was the most curious pile of all: the books, hard drives, and handwritten papers. Some of these were taken by the SEALs, but enough remained to sketch the outlines of bin Laden's final intellectual world. His bookshelf was erratic, stacked with texts in Arabic, Urdu, English, and even Pashto. Titles on Western military history were found alongside conspiracy books on Zionist plots and US political manipulation. He had a copy of Guns, Germs and Steel, a Time magazine cover story on Obama, and a pamphlet titled How to Win Friends and Influence People. A bizarre choice for someone whose entire career was rooted in antagonism. One folder, labelled simply Correspondence, included letters to and from family members, fellow militants, and contacts across the region. Some were ideological manifestos, others were personal appeals. In a letter addressed to his son Hamza, bin Laden wrote, "If the sword is heavy in your hand, let your words carry the blade." Hamza would later become a significant figure in jihadist propaganda until his reported death in 2017. But it wasn't just what they found that stunned investigators, it was what they didn't find. No advanced weapons, no large cash reserves, no tunnels or escape routes, no operational centre. The Abbottabad compound was not a command post, it was a cocoon, a place of shelter, of isolation, of slow decay. For all the fear bin Laden had inspired, the place where he spent his final years was hauntingly domestic. Downstairs, the rooms bore traces of a life lived in whispering repetition. A chalkboard with Arabic letters scrawled on it, presumably used to teach the children. Stacks of lined paper covered in juvenile handwriting. Children's drawings taped to the walls, smiling suns, palm trees, and stick figures labelled Baba. In the kitchen, investigators found large sacks of rice, flour and lentils, a few half-used spice jars. The refrigerator was modest, stocked with yogurt, flatbread and vegetables from the garden. Bin Laden's family had lived off simple food, prepared daily by the women in rotation. The wives' rooms were sparse, each decorated only with the bare essentials: a thin mattress, a small storage trunk, and sometimes a few personal keepsakes. One had a collection of scented oils. Another kept a worn-out book of poetry hidden inside a hollowed-out Quranic commentary. The rooms weren't places of comfort. They were places of waiting. Up on the rooftop, investigators noticed a curious feature. A series of makeshift blinds rigged from fabric and string. These had likely been used to shield anyone from being seen by overhead drones or neighbouring rooftops. From that height, the compound's walls seemed even taller. The world outside, so close, so real, might as well have been on another planet. And just beyond those walls, Pakistan stirred. The news of the raid and bin Laden's death had erupted like a supernova. Protesters gathered in the streets, some cheering, others burning flags. Political commentators questioned how the compound had escaped notice. Inside Pakistan's military and intelligence ranks, heads turned sharply, some in shame, others in suspicion. Had the government known? Had the ISI harboured him, or merely failed to detect him? Theories abounded. Some claimed rogue elements within the military had protected him. Others blamed incompetence or bureaucratic silence. Still others suggested a deal had been made, a silent arrangement allowing him to live unbothered in exchange for silence or intelligence. Nothing was proven. But the embarrassment to Pakistan's military apparatus was profound. Within days, the compound was sealed. Investigators moved through in waves, forensic teams, intelligence analysts, even psychologists. They photographed everything, measured walls, examined fingerprints, dusted for DNA. The goal wasn't just to confirm the kill, it was to understand the man they'd hunted for over a decade. Even more chilling was the evidence gathered from digital storage. Hundreds of gigabytes of data, much of it encrypted, was eventually recovered. Emails never sent. Speeches never delivered. Strategy documents outlining possible alliances with anti-Western groups across Africa and Southeast Asia. But perhaps most eerie were the video clips. Bin Laden had been recording himself. Some were rough rehearsals for future speeches. Others were practice takes, adjusting lighting, reading from notes, trying different facial expressions. In one, he fumbles a line, chuckles to himself, then restarts. It was hauntingly ordinary. A man used to performing. A man aware that image was power, and yet he never released these recordings. Perhaps he no longer trusted the network to distribute them. Perhaps he feared being discovered. Perhaps he no longer liked what he saw on the screen. Then there were the surveillance oddities. Cameras installed outside the compound, by local authorities in later days, picked up an odd silence before the raid. Dogs barked, then stopped. Lights blinked, then stayed off. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, a kind of stillness so total it vibrated. The raid may have taken 40 minutes, but its echoes would stretch across decades. Back in Washington, the White House released select details. DNA confirmed the identity. The body, washed and wrapped in accordance with Islamic rites, had been buried at sea. The photos of bin Laden's corpse were never released publicly, citing the fear of inflaming further violence. But the physical evidence from the compound, letters, videos, hard drives, formed a different kind of legacy. Not just of a terrorist mastermind, but of a man slowly collapsing under the weight of his own myth. In those rooms were contradictions too human to ignore. A man who orchestrated mass murder, now correcting his daughter's grammar on a torn sheet of paper. A firebrand leader, now watching documentaries and reading self-help manuals. A man so feared he vanished, only to be found hiding in a house with no escape hatch. It was, in the end, not just a mission completed, but a myth punctured. And as bulldozers later reduced the compound to rubble, the dust lifted not only from bricks, but from the shadowy history he tried so hard to control. When the helicopters vanished into the early morning sky, the final chapter of Osama bin Laden's life came to a brutal, definitive close. But for the analysts, operatives and historians who would dissect his years in hiding, the story was far from over. The real shock, many would come to agree, was not that he had died, but how he had lived. As CIA officials began combing through the material recovered from the Abbottabad compound, the image of bin Laden as a ghostly recluse began to crack. His hideout had not been a bunker sealed from the world. It had been an intellectual factory, producing letters, manifestos, speeches, and geological blueprints that reflected a man still trying to steer the storm he had helped unleash. The collection was staggering. Over 100 flash drives, 5 computers, dozens of DVDs, hundreds of documents, many handwritten, stored in envelopes, notebooks, and folders. Intelligence officers, translators, and counter-terrorism specialists launched into what would become the most significant intelligence exploitation in recent US history. The data trove became known internally as the Abbottabad Papers. At first, the CIA focused on leads, names, networks, operations in progress, but as the material was catalogued, what emerged was a multi-layered portrait of a man not only consumed by ideology, but also obsessed with legacy, betrayal, and control. Among the first discoveries, detailed family trees. Bin Laden had sketched out not just his lineage, but those of his couriers, commanders, and even rival jihadi leaders. In a series of diagrams, he attempted to map loyalty, not through blood, but ideology. Arrows pointed toward potential successors, with annotations like firm belief or needs guidance. One peculiar find: a small stack of letters written by one of his wives, Kyria. These notes, never sent, revealed her frustrations, both with life in confinement and with Bin Laden himself. She questioned the wisdom of staying in the same place for so long. She wrote, "You believe still that silence will protect us. I believe silence has built a grave." Her words were both prophetic and tragic. The cache also included drafts of speeches never delivered. In one, Bin Laden planned to address the Arab Spring directly. He wrote passionately about the opportunity for purification and warned of Western attempts to co-opt the people's will. But the speech, revised multiple times, was ultimately shelved. He feared it would reveal too much about his location. He feared perhaps that it wouldn't be enough to reassert his fading relevance. Then there were the documents that stunned even the most seasoned analysts, plans for future attacks. Some were complex, outlining multi-phase operations in Europe, the US and Asia. Others were speculative, ideas for poisoning water supplies, attacking oil tankers, targeting symbolic events. But many were dated, delayed, unfeasible. They reflected a man trying to exert influence without resources or real-time communication, a commander without an army. And then came the personal files. His letters to his children were laced with tenderness and control. To Hamza, "Learn, be strong, lead with clarity, do not rush into martyrdom. Your voice will carry farther than your bullet." To one of his daughters, "If I am remembered, let it be by those who knew my smile, not only my shadow." These were not the words of a man preparing for war, but of one preparing to be remembered. Most haunting was a handwritten will, buried deep in one of the notebooks. In it, Bin Laden divided modest possessions among his family and called upon Allah to forgive his sins. He asked to be buried according to Islamic rites. He instructed that no photos of his body be made public, and he pleaded that his children be protected, not from the West, but from the temptations of modernity. "They must know the truth," he wrote, "but not be blinded by the noise of false freedom." Ironically, the truth of his own life, the noise he tried so hard to mute, would soon become global conversation. Because beyond the ideological goldmine, the SEALs also recovered an assortment of items that felt almost comical in their contrast to the gravity of the man. There was a stash of hair dye, yes, just for men, jet black, a dozen small packets, half used. Apparently Bin Laden had continued to dye his beard until the end. Vanity, symbolism, perhaps both. There were medications, mostly herbal, a few painkillers, no evidence of dialysis or serious medical equipment, putting to rest years of speculation that he had been terminally ill. There were also videos, some of jihadi speeches, some, bizarrely, of news clips, Hollywood films, even animated shorts. Whether he watched them personally, or they were simply passed along as courier bundles, no one could say for sure. But their presence added to the surreal image of a man once declared enemy number one, now watching documentaries about climate change in a third-floor room while chickens clucked below. One video, played in the aftermath by analysts, showed Bin Laden seated cross-legged on the floor, watching television coverage of himself. He looked thinner, older, the beard half dyed. He stroked it absently as he watched his younger self speak to a camera from years before. No expression, just silent observation. For a man who had once controlled the world's attention, His final audience had been reduced to a handful of wives, children, and the occasional courier. Back in the United States, the intelligence take was used to map al-Qaeda's current network, uncover plots, and in some cases locate and eliminate key figures. But much of the data revealed something else. An organisation struggling to hold coherence. Splinter groups were operating autonomously. Communications were delayed by weeks. Some affiliates no longer even recognised bin Laden's authority. In one intercepted letter, a field commander in Yemen referred to him as the Old One, saying, "He writes from a grave." The notion hit hard. Bin Laden, who had once redefined global conflict, had become an echo in his own movement. Revered, yes. Quoted, certainly. But increasingly irrelevant to the pace and tone of jihadist warfare. Groups like ISIS, still in embryonic form at the time, would later reject his strategy altogether. And yet, what bin Laden left behind shaped the battlefield in a different way. His writings, many of which were later declassified and released to the public, provided a rare glimpse into the mind of a man shaped by war, obsession, faith, and fear. They revealed not a monster nor a martyr, but a deeply flawed human being grappling with the very myth he had created. He was furious at al-Qaeda's image problems, upset by civilian deaths, angry about ideological drift, concerned about succession. He was trying to hold together a story that had outgrown him, a man building walls around a legacy that was, brick by brick, crumbling beneath him. In the end, it was not drones or spies or betrayals that exposed him. It was routine. The same courier, the same steps across the floor, the same laundry line hung at the same time each day, and when the helicopters came they shattered not just his body, but the illusion that he had outsmarted the world. The things he took with him into the next world were few, a prayer on his lips perhaps, the echoes of his son's voice, the sound of helicopters in the distance, and the things he left behind. Paper, wires, questions. So many questions. Even as the dust settled in Abbottabad, the ripples from that quiet Pakistani city spread outward, touching every corner of the world. The compound was gone. The man was gone. But what remained, buried in bites, diaries, and broken furniture, was something even harder to erase. The mythology. Osama bin Laden had spent the last decade of his life trying to control his image, sculpting it with the precision of a master propagandist. And yet, in death, he became something else entirely. His legacy no longer belonged to him. In the United States, the victory was framed as both justice and closure. The SEAL team returned to relative obscurity, though their operation became legend. Books, films, documentaries, dozens of them, tried to capture the essence of the raid. Some focused on the precision, others on the morality, and some simply on the question, how did he last so long? Politicians debated the fallout. Some claimed the raid justified every dollar spent, every surveillance program, every drone strike. Others warned that it didn't end the war. It only changed its face. The US pulled out of Afghanistan years later, but the narrative of bin Laden remained a spectre in every foreign policy debate. He had become shorthand, not just for terror, but for the impossibility of clean endings. Across the Middle East and South Asia, the responses were layered with complexity. For some, he was a martyr. For others, a villain. For many, he was simply a figure whose choices had changed the world they lived in, sometimes irreparably. In classrooms, his name was discussed in history lessons alongside other men who had altered the course of empires. But unlike Alexander or Napoleon, bin Laden had fought not with armies, but with ideas, cameras, and fear. And yet, perhaps the most telling transformation of all came from the internet. In the years after his death, bin Laden became a meme, literally. Images of him were edited, altered, parodied. In forums and comment threads, people joked about his DVDs, his bunker habits, his hair dye. A still frame from a video of him watching himself on TV was turned into a viral image. The terrorist as couch potato. Some found it tasteless. Others saw it as cultural catharsis, a way to defang the monster by reducing him to a punchline. But in doing so, the world revealed something deeper, that even the darkest figures become myth, and all myths bend to the needs of the storyteller. Bin Laden's final years were not those of a mastermind at the helm. They were years of retreat, of erosion, of confinement. His goals remained, but his grasp faded, He had built an ideology that many still followed, but the shape it took was far from what he envisioned. He wrote of restraint, others chose carnage. He imagined a global caliphate. They built black flag territories of brutality. He wanted history to remember him as a thinker, a shepherd of the Ummah. Instead, he was remembered with memes, midnight raids, and a burial at sea. Historians still argue whether bin Laden truly lost control of his movement, or whether he never really had it to begin with. One theory suggests that by 2006, Al-Qaeda was already splintering beyond his influence, that the advent of social media, decentralized cells, and self-radicalization had made his centralized vision obsolete, that the internet he feared had replaced him with faster, louder voices. Others insist that his writings continued to influence doctrine, even posthumously, that his ghost still lingers in strategy documents, recruitment videos, and sermons recorded in dim basements. But what cannot be debated is that the final chapter of his life defied the cinematic arc many imagined. There was no desert firefight, no underground fortress, no desperate last stand. Instead, there was a quiet house, a tall wall, a man watching grainy footage of himself while the world turned without him. And in that house, in that stillness, time passed, slowly, almost politely, until the silence was broken by the blades of a helicopter. Some of his children would later try to escape the legacy, others would embrace it. Hamza, the so-called Crown Prince of Terror, was groomed to carry the torch, but was killed before he could rise. Other sons vanished from public view, scattered across the globe. His daughters, less documented, less involved, reportedly live quiet lives, defined not by ideology, but by evasion. They move in shadows not of their choosing. As for his wives, some returned to their home countries, others remained in custody for years. None ever spoke publicly in detail about those final years. One was asked if bin Laden had changed in hiding. She said simply, he was still the man, but smaller. And maybe that's the real end to the story, not in explosions or ideology, but in scale. Because the shocking truth about bin Laden's life in hiding is how small it became, how ordinary, how human. A man obsessed with shaping global destiny reduced in the end to a pile of papers, a broken TV and a worn prayer mat. And that may be the most haunting legacy of all. So here we are, back at the edge of night. You followed footsteps through shadows, through walls that kept the world out, and through the mind of a man who once shaped that world with terrifying precision. And now he is just a name in a file, a blurry photo in an old archive, a whisper in the corridors of power. Let that image fade gently. The compound, the pacing man, the quiet children. See the lights dim one by one until all that remains is a rectangle of moonlight on the floor. There's no more movement, no more planning, just stillness. The kind that settles after a long, breathless chase. Whether you came here for closure, curiosity, or just to wonder how history happens, thank you for staying, for listening, for walking slowly through a world where not every question gets an answer, and not every villain stays large in memory. Rest now. Let your breath slow. Let the echo of helicopters dissolve into the soft hush of night. Tomorrow brings another story, another mystery, another figure behind another curtain. But for now, the curtain falls.